It was late in the season when my buddy and I decided to take one last camping trip before the snow came. We had been camping all over Colorado and Utah for years, so the idea of finding a quiet, empty place off-season didn't seem like a big deal. The Poudre Canyon, outside Fort Collins, was one of those places that always felt rugged and quiet. A place where the air smelled like pine and dirt, and where the nights were colder than you expected. Most of the campgrounds were already closed for the year, so we drove along one of the side roads that wound deep into the canyon and found a little pull-off that looked flat enough for a tent. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, and that blue, empty kind of quiet had already settled in the woods. Something about the spot didn't feel right, though. It wasn't anything obvious, just the way the trees seemed too close together, or how there wasn't a sound, not even wind through the branches. We both felt it. It wasn't fear, just a kind of tension, like being watched without really being watched. Still, we shrugged it off. You get that feeling sometimes when you're deep in the woods and your brain starts playing tricks on you. We parked the truck, got out, and started setting up camp. Not long after we picked our spot, we found a blanket just lying there under a deadfall. It was old and faded, like it had been out there for months. Wrapped inside was something small and stiff. When I opened it up with a stick, I saw the skeletal remains of what looked like a small animal, maybe a cat or a raccoon. The skull was picked clean, and the body was half decayed. The way it had been wrapped up felt intentional. It wasn't just an animal that had died and been eaten. Someone had taken the time to wrap it carefully before leaving it there. That set a weird tone for the rest of the day. Neither of us said much after that. We both just kind of avoided looking at the blanket and kept setting up camp. We decided to go for a hike before dark to get a lay of the area. The slope behind camp went up into a mess of dense pine and rock, the kind of terrain that forces you to use your hands half the time. The ground was soft with layers of old needles, and the smell of sap was heavy in the air. As we climbed higher, the canyon opened up below us. We could see the thin ribbon of road twisting far beneath and the creek reflecting the last light of day. We climbed until the incline got too steep, and that's when we noticed something odd up ahead. A flash of color against the dark tree bark. It was a tent, or what was left of one. It was hanging partway up a tree, like someone had wrapped it around the trunk. The fabric was torn and sun-bleached. At first I thought maybe it had blown there from a storm, but it was too neatly placed, almost like it had been tied. The branches around it were stripped bare where the tent was hooked, and inside it looked like someone had stuffed things in. Some notebooks, a sleeping bag, and a few other scraps of gear. The notebooks were damp and stuck together. I flipped one open, and the pages were full of messy handwriting, but most of the words were blurred from moisture. The whole thing made my stomach twist a little. It didn't feel like trash or litter. It felt like someone had left it on purpose. Maybe a hiker who had disappeared? Maybe someone living rough out there. We didn't stay long. There was a heavy silence around that spot that made it hard to breathe, so we turned around and started heading back down the hill. Going down was harder than climbing up. The slope was steep, covered in loose dirt and needles that made every step a slip. Halfway down, a smell hit us, sharp and sweet, the kind of smell that only means one thing: death. You never forget that smell once you've caught it. It cuts through everything. We followed it without meaning to, drawn to it like something you can't look away from. A few yards below us, tucked between two pines, was something wrapped in a small towel. It was wedged against the trunk, placed almost carefully, not dropped or fallen. The towel was white once, but it had gone gray from dirt. Whatever was inside was small but solid, and there was a dark stain on one edge.
I didn't touch it.
My buddy didn't either. We just stood there, staring at it, both knowing what it probably was and not wanting to confirm it. We left it there and made our way back down to camp. The smell lingered in my nose even after we were away from it. We didn't talk about it, just sat by the fire for a while, letting the silence press in. The woods around us felt alive in a strange way. Not with animals or sounds, but like the place itself was holding its breath. It was too quiet, even for that time of year. Usually you'd at least hear a few night birds or wind in the trees. There was nothing. Just that thick, unmoving silence that made the fire crackle sound too loud. As the night went on, the air grew colder. The bourbon helped, but it also made my thoughts feel heavy and slow. I kept thinking about that towel. It didn't make sense. Someone had gone out of their way to carry a dead thing halfway up a steep slope, wrap it carefully, and tuck it into a tree. There was no reason to do that. Not that far off the road, not that far from nowhere. It wasn't like an animal had done it. No creature wrapped something in fabric. It was deliberate. That thought stuck in my head and wouldn't leave. After a while, the fire burned down and we sat staring at the coals, pretending we weren't both thinking the same thing. Eventually, maybe out of curiosity or just a kind of reckless need to know, we decided we had to go back up there. It was stupid, but the bourbon made it easier to convince ourselves it was fine. We grabbed a flashlight and a long stick and hiked back up the slope. The cold air cut at my face as we climbed, and my breath came out in white puffs. The flashlight beam jumped between trees, catching bits of bark and moss that looked like faces in the dark. When we finally reached the spot again, the towel was still there, undisturbed. I didn't want to use my hands, so I crouched and used the stick to pull the towel open. Inside was an owl, a big one, but its body was limp and its feathers still glossy, like it hadn't been dead long. Its eyes were half open, cloudy but fresh. Its neck looked broken. Whoever had done it had taken care not to damage it much, just enough to kill it. The towel smelled faintly of detergent under the stronger smell of decay, which meant it hadn't been there long either. Someone had been out here recently, doing this, wrapping things up, hiding them in the trees. Maybe it was some kind of ritual, maybe some weird local thing, but it didn't feel like that. It felt personal, like someone had done it for their own reason. Something we didn't want to understand. We stood there for a long time, the cold seeping through my jacket, listening for anything in the woods. There was nothing. No branches breaking, no wind, no sound. Just that stillness that felt wrong. We backed down slowly, our boots slipping in the dirt, and didn't say a word all the way back to camp. The fire had burned low when we returned, just glowing coals now. We sat there, staring into them until sleep started to pull at our eyes. I don't remember falling asleep, but I woke up sometime in the night, heart pounding, sure I'd heard something move outside the tent. Not footsteps, just a sound like something brushing against the fabric. I waited, holding my breath, but it never came again. We left as soon as the sky began to lighten. The morning air was cold enough to bite at our fingers as we packed up. The woods looked normal in the daylight, quiet, still, harmless. It made the night before feel like a bad dream, but it wasn't. Before we drove off, I looked back once at the ridge where we'd found the owl. The trees up there stood dark against the brightening sky. I couldn't see the towel from that distance, but I knew it was still there, tucked into that tree, waiting. We didn't talk about it on the drive home. We didn't need to. There are some places that feel wrong for reasons you'll never know. You just don't go back to them. My friend and I had this small piece of land we thought of as ours, tucked deep along the edge of a national forest in California. It wasn't an official campsite or anything close to that. You couldn't find it on a map, or even really explain how to get there unless you'd been before. We'd discovered it a few years back, following a game trail that split off a dirt service road most people probably drove right past without noticing. After a few long hikes, we realized it opened up into this wide clearing that ended beside a small pond. It felt untouched, quiet, and perfectly hidden. Every time we went, it felt like we were stepping somewhere nobody else knew existed. The pond reflected everything around it like glass, tall pines, distant mountains, the faint shimmer of the sky. It always smelled like pine sap and wet dirt. That place became sort of our escape. No cell service, no other people. No sounds except what belonged there. We'd been going there for a couple of summers. Usually we'd pack light, some food, a cooler, a tent, a small propane stove. We'd drive my old truck up the service road until the dirt got too rough to continue, park in the same spot every time, and then hike the rest of the way in. It was a steep half-hour walk down through narrow switchbacks, roots and rocks sticking up everywhere. You couldn't take your eyes off your footing for a second. But when you broke through the last line of trees, it was worth it. That clearing always looked the same, open and bright in the day, cold and still at night. Nothing man-made in sight. That's why it always felt strange to leave. Like we were abandoning something that existed just for us. That one trip started like any other. Early morning, clear skies, gear in the back of the truck, coffee in hand. We didn't say much on the drive. It was one of those quiet mornings where the road noise and the hum of the tires kind of put you in a calm state. The plan was to stay for 2 nights, maybe do some fishing if the water level was decent. We turned off onto the dirt road that cut through a stretch of burned forest. Scorched trunks and deadfall everywhere from an old fire years back. I remember the air got colder when we reached the higher elevation, the kind that burns your lungs a little when you breathe deep. We were maybe a quarter mile from the spot where we always parked when I saw movement ahead through the dust and trees. At first I thought it was just deer or maybe elk. Then I slowed down and realized it was 2 mountain lions, a male and a female. I'd never seen one that close before, not in person. They were right in the middle of the road, not 20 yards in front of the truck, and it took me a second to process what was going on. They were mating, right there on the road where we always parked. I stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and we both just sat there staring. It was such a strange sight, the way their bodies moved, the way the female hissed and twisted, the deep, low growl that carried even through the closed windows. It made my skin crawl a little. It wasn't something you ever expect to witness out there. For a second I thought about backing up and leaving. You don't mess with mountain lions, especially during something like that. But they finished up pretty quickly and then just sort of stayed there, lounging near the roadside brush, licking their paws and rolling in the dirt. We figured it was safe enough to just wait it out. We had the windows up, and the smell of warm pine and dust filled the cab. We watched them quietly, fascinated by how relaxed they seemed afterward. It was strange to see predators that calm, so at ease like house cats, just existing in their world without any thought of us. For about 10 minutes, it felt like we were watching some hidden piece of nature most people never get to see. Then something changed. Both of them stopped moving all at once. Their heads lifted, ears forward, bodies stiff. You could see the muscles in their shoulders tighten. The female stood first, tail twitching. The male followed, crouched low. They were staring into the trees off to our right, not looking at us anymore, completely focused on something we couldn't see. I remember how their posture changed. One moment lazy and calm, the next tense and ready to bolt. Whatever they heard or smelled, it wasn't normal. We couldn't hear anything inside the truck, but I remember feeling the air get heavier, like the woods had gone completely silent. Then, almost as one, both lions turned and ran off the road into the brush. They didn't slink away quietly like cats usually do. They sprinted fast, low, gone in seconds. It was so sudden that for a moment we just sat there in stunned silence. I thought maybe they smelled us, or maybe another predator. But the direction they ran from caught my attention, because only a few seconds later, something else came through the same stretch of trees. First came 3 deer, bursting out of the tree line and sprinting across the road so fast they barely touched the ground. Their hooves kicked up dirt and pine needles as they darted past. They were completely panicked, heads low, tongues out, like they were running for their lives. And right behind them, not even 30 feet back, came a bear. A massive bear, bigger than any I'd ever seen in those woods. Brown coat, matted and thick, shoulders humped up like a moving boulder. You could see its breath in the air as it ran. The kind of power that makes you realize just how fragile you are. It wasn't running at us. It was chasing those deer full tilt, pounding through the clearing and back into the trees on the other side. The whole thing lasted maybe 10 seconds, but it felt longer. When it was over, there was nothing but dust in the air, drifting sunlight cutting through the trees and the sound of my own breathing. I didn't even realize I'd been gripping the steering wheel until my hands started to hurt. The woods were completely silent again after that, not even birds. It was like everything in the area had stopped to watch that moment. I remember looking at my friend and then back toward the trees, half expecting something else to come through. But nothing did. The forest stayed still, and it stayed that way for a while. We sat there a few minutes longer, both of us just trying to let our nerves settle. There was no need to talk about it. The idea of hiking down into the clearing after seeing that felt stupid. That bear was close, closer than anything should have been, and if it was chasing deer through that area, it meant it was hungry or aggressive. It probably had been hunting around that pond for a while. And the lions too. It all meant the area wasn't as quiet or untouched as we'd always thought. Predators don't hang around without a reason. We both knew then that we weren't the only ones who found that place special. We ended up turning the truck around and heading back down the dirt road. The excitement from that morning had turned into this heavy silence. The forest that used to feel peaceful now felt alive in a way that didn't include us. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see something following us. The smell of pine still came through the vents, but now it felt different, sharper somehow. The same road we'd always driven suddenly looked smaller, darker, more confined. That day changed how I thought about the woods. They weren't ours, and they never had been. They belonged to everything wild that lived there, things that were just better at hiding than we were at finding. We never went back to that spot again. It's still there, probably untouched just like it always was, with the pond and the clearing and the quiet. But in my mind, it's no longer peaceful. It's a reminder of what's really out there when you think you're alone. Sometimes when I think about it, I still see the lions stiffen up before bolting, the blur of deer in full sprint, and that huge bear tearing through the trees. That moment was nature at its most raw and indifferent, and that was enough to make me realize I didn't belong there anymore. I remember that day with a strange kind of sharpness. Like certain memories refuse to fade, no matter how much time or therapy or distance you put between yourself and them. I was somewhere in the middle of my solo trip around the Olympic Peninsula, just driving wherever the road felt quiet enough. I had spent the previous few days camping near the coast, hiking short trails, sleeping in the back of my car with the windows cracked open to the sound of wind moving through old trees. I wasn't in any kind of rush. I just wanted to see the park, breathe that damp, mossy air, and be alone for a while. When I saw the sign for Kino, I decided to take the turn. No plan, no destination. I just wanted to see what was there. The road wound along the water for a bit and then turned inland, climbing through thick forest. The smell of cedar and wet earth filled the air, and everything felt still. It wasn't tourist season, and there wasn't another car anywhere. The pavement eventually narrowed until it turned into gravel, and then it just ended. The road stopped right at the river, where a wide bend opened up and sunlight hit the surface like glass. It was a perfect hidden spot, framed by trees on all sides, the kind of place that felt untouched. Across the water, an old footbridge stretched over the current, sagging in the middle like it had been forgotten for decades. The wood was gray and thin, the rope supports frayed, one side of the railing hanging loose. I could tell even from where I stood that it would never hold weight. Still, it looked beautiful in a haunting way, like something left behind from a different time. It was warmer than usual for fall. The air felt heavy and still, almost too still. And after a few minutes standing at the edge, I decided I wanted to swim. I hadn't planned to, but the heat and the stillness got to me. The water was crystal clear, and I could see the smooth stones beneath it, polished by years of flow. I backed my car right up to the edge of the road so it was facing out in the direction I'd leave. I left the driver's side door unlocked, just out of habit, and grabbed a towel and my keys before climbing down the embankment. There was no real path, just a slope covered in vines, roots, and ferns. The brush was thick enough to scratch at my legs as I pushed through. The smell of crushed vegetation was sharp in the air, and I could hear small insects humming around. By the time I made it down to the riverbank, I was sweating, and the water looked colder and clearer than ever. I stripped down to my underwear and waded in. The cold hit me fast, but it felt incredible after the heat. I floated for a few minutes, letting the current move around me, the sound of the river covering everything else. But it didn't take long before something about the silence started to feel wrong. Even though I couldn't hear anything but the water and birds, I couldn't shake the idea that someone was nearby. I kept glancing toward the tree line, toward that broken footbridge, toward the other side of the river. Everything looked still, just thick forest and shadows. But there was a weight in the air that made the back of my neck tighten. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just the isolation. the kind that plays tricks on your nerves when you're completely alone. After about 5 minutes, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. I couldn't enjoy the water anymore. I moved toward the edge, climbing out where I had left my pile of clothes. I was dripping wet, my feet sinking into the wet stones as I reached for my shirt. That's when I turned around and saw him. He was standing directly across from me on the opposite side of the river, a little higher up on his embankment. He was tall, maybe 6.5 feet or more, and broad but thin in a wiry, sunken way. His hair was long and matted with dirt and sticks, and his face looked weathered, almost gray. He wore what looked like a poncho made from animal hides, the kind that looked crudely stitched together. His arms hung at his sides, his skin the same tone as the bark behind him. He wasn't moving. He was just standing there, looking straight at me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, the air catching in my throat. It felt like we had been locked in that stare for minutes, but it was probably only seconds. Then suddenly he broke into motion, fast and wild, heading up the slope toward the direction of the old footbridge. That's when my body reacted before my mind did. I grabbed my car key from the pile, tried to scoop up my clothes, but the fabric got tangled in blackberry vines that covered the slope. I pulled hard, but the thorns tore into my skin, slicing lines into my arms and legs. I gave up, left everything, and just ran. The brush clawed at me as I scrambled upward, barefoot and half-naked, the ground uneven and slick under my feet. I could hear my breath ragged in my ears and the blood rushing through my head. When I finally broke through the tree line near the road, I could see him again. He was halfway across the bridge now, moving faster than I could believe. The old wood creaked and groaned under his weight, but it held. He was coming straight toward me. I sprinted to my car, flung the door open, and slammed it shut, locking it just as he reached the edge of the road. The sound he made wasn't like speech. It was guttural, deep, like someone trying to scream without words. He pounded on the hood with both fists, his body jerking in wild motions, hair flying, his breath visible in the warm air. The whole car shook under the impact. I could see his eyes through the windshield, wide, unblinking, filled with some kind of raw rage or madness. When he moved toward my side door, I hit the gas. The tires spun on the gravel before catching, and I shot forward down that narrow road, the sound of stones hitting the undercarriage. In the rearview mirror, I saw him running after me, still screaming, his arms swinging wildly. He kept up longer than I thought possible, his shape shrinking in the mirror but still moving. It felt endless until he finally disappeared into the blur of trees. I didn't stop driving until I reached a paved section near the main highway. I pulled over only long enough to make sure I hadn't blown a tire. My hands were trembling so badly I could barely turn the key off. Blood was running down my shins from the blackberry cuts, my skin raw and burning. I sat there for a while, shaking, trying to process what had just happened. The image of that man still burned behind my eyes. It took me hours before I felt steady enough to drive again. When I finally reached the nearest small town, I found a place to stay the night. I remember the woman at the front desk giving me a strange look when I walked in wearing just my towel and jacket, bleeding and barefoot. I told her I'd fallen while hiking, and she didn't ask more. I locked the door to that room and didn't sleep for the rest of the night. Even now, years later, I still can't explain what that man was doing there, how long he'd been living out there, what he wanted, or how he knew I was at the river. I only know that he wasn't lost. He moved with purpose, like he knew the forest and the bridge and the land better than anyone else ever could. I've gone through every possible explanation in my mind, but none of them make the memory any easier to live with. I never went back to that area. I never even drove near it again. Whenever I hike now, I always bring someone else, no matter how safe it seems or how short the trail is. That feeling of being watched has never really left me. Every time I hear a branch snap in the woods, my mind goes right back to that riverbank, to the sight of that man standing there, staring across the water at me, waiting for the moment to move. I had just finished a 7-day canoe trip through Algonquin Park, and my body felt like it had been beaten by the elements. My hands were raw from paddling, my shoulders burned, and everything I owned smelled faintly of damp wood and lake water. I'd gotten up early that morning to break camp and make my way back to the access point. The forest had been still, the air heavy with that thick late summer humidity that makes even breathing feel like effort. I remember the quiet, the kind that follows you after days out in the wilderness, where you start to hear your own heartbeat more than anything else. By the time I reached the parking lot, I was ready for the world again. I had that drained but satisfied feeling, the kind you get when you've done something hard and it's finally over. The gravel under my boots crunched as I walked toward my car. It looked strange sitting there after so long in the woods, like something from another life. I opened the trunk, the hinges squealing in the warm air, and started tossing my gear in. Packs, paddles, food barrels, all still damp from the trip. I was half bent over, shoving things around so they'd fit, when I heard a burst of noise from somewhere nearby. It sounded like excited voices, high, quick chatter that didn't fit with the lazy afternoon stillness. I straightened up and looked over the roofs of the parked cars. There were a few people gathered about 2 cars down from me, phones in hand, pointing at something. At first, I thought maybe it was a bear. That happens sometimes in Algonquin. People get careless with food, and a black bear wanders close to check things out. But the sound coming from them wasn't fear. It was excitement, like they'd just spotted a celebrity. I stepped around the back of my car to get a better look, and that's when I saw it. A bull moose had wandered into the parking lot. It looked almost surreal at first, this massive animal just casually moving between rows of cars like it belonged there. It was enormous, towering above the vehicles, its antlers wide and dark like the branches of a dead tree. Its fur was wet and matted in spots, its sides heaving as it moved, steam rising from its nostrils in the warm air. The sound of its hooves on the gravel was deep and rhythmic like slow drum beats. I froze for a moment, just watching it. It moved slowly, unbothered, the way animals do when they know they're the biggest thing around. My brain finally caught up with what I was seeing, and I ducked behind my car, pulling my phone out automatically. My heart was pounding, but not from fear, more from awe. I peeked around the bumper and started recording. The moose was only maybe 30 feet away, walking right through the middle of the lot, its head turning slightly with each step. I could hear the people near it talking rapidly, their voices jittery with excitement. It was a group of tourists, maybe 5 or 6 of them, standing close together with cameras raised. I could see one of them, a man in a white shirt, edging closer to the moose. Way too close. I felt a spike of tension watching him move forward, step after step, like he thought it was a tame animal from a petting zoo. The moose didn't seem to notice at first. It stopped near a patch of grass by the tree line, lowered its head, and started chewing lazily. The man kept moving toward it, one arm stretched out like he was trying to touch it. I remember holding my breath. The moose's head came up slowly, its ears swiveling back. It gave a sharp snort, and that sound was enough to make me flinch even from behind my car. The man stopped, finally realizing how close he was. The moose stared at him for a few long seconds, its nostrils flaring. Then, without warning, it swung its head slightly, let out another deep breath, and turned toward the forest. It took a few long strides and disappeared into the trees, moving with a power that didn't match how heavy it looked. The man didn't back away. He ran after it. For a second, I couldn't believe what I was seeing. He jogged straight toward the spot where it had gone, still holding his phone up, like he thought he could follow it and get a better shot. The rest of the group stayed in the lot, calling out for him, but he was already disappearing into the woods. I stood there, watching the trees move where the moose had gone in, and for a moment I actually expected to hear a scream. My stomach twisted just thinking about it. A bull moose can run over 30 miles an hour, and they don't have patience for people who get in their space. I waited, staring at the line of trees, half expecting to see the man come stumbling out, bleeding or worse. But the forest stayed quiet. After a minute, he came back. He looked sweaty and out of breath, his phone still in his hand, shaking his head and laughing like it was all a big joke. The others gathered around him, probably checking his video. I couldn't hear much from where I was. Just the kind of giddy laughter people make when they know they've done something stupid but think it's funny anyway. I stayed behind my car for a while longer, heart still beating too fast. Eventually, I went back to packing my stuff, but the feeling didn't fade. My hands were shaking a little when I tightened the straps on my canoe. I kept looking over at the spot where the moose had disappeared. It was so easy to forget after a week alone out there that the wild doesn't care about what people think is safe. You can spend days surrounded by beauty and quiet, and then one careless step turns everything dangerous. Before I left, I sat in my car for a minute, letting the engine idle. The tourists had piled into their vehicles and driven off, probably heading for the nearest diner to tell the story about how close they'd gotten to a moose. I stayed there and watched the edge of the forest. The air smelled like pine and sun-warmed asphalt, and somewhere far off I could hear a loon calling across the lake. It struck me how fragile the boundary was between us and that world. Just a thin strip of gravel and steel, separating people from something ancient and unpredictable. As I drove out of the lot, I passed the trailhead where the moose had entered. The ground there was still disturbed, fresh tracks in the mud, deep and wide, leading into the trees. For a moment I imagined what would have happened if the bull had been in rut, or if that man had touched it or startled it. I could picture it too clearly, the weight of it, the speed, the sound of hooves and antlers crashing. The idea stayed with me the whole drive out of the park. By the time I reached the highway, the forest was a blur in my rearview mirror. I felt grateful in a way I hadn't expected. Not just to be leaving, but to have witnessed that moment and seen how close someone came to crossing a line they didn't even understand. Out there, everything looks calm until it isn't. One second, it's just a parking lot on a warm afternoon, and the next, it's a reminder that the wild isn't there for our entertainment. I didn't take it as a story to laugh about. To me, it felt more like a warning that stuck, something that kept me quiet for the rest of the drive home. I was camping deep in the Amazon rainforest with a small group of people, not in some tourist-friendly area, but far inside where the forest felt endless and thick like a living thing that could swallow you whole. The trees there grew so high they blocked most of the sky, and even during the day the light came down in patches, thin and filtered, always moving as the leaves shifted above. At night, though, it was a different world. The jungle never went silent, but it was the kind of sound that made you feel small. Frogs, insects, birds, and things moving in the brush. The air never cooled off completely. It just stayed heavy, humid, and full of that deep earthy smell that sticks to your clothes and hair. That night I had been sleeping inside my small tent, zipped up tight because of the mosquitoes. I remember the sound of the forest seemed louder than usual, but that could have been my mind playing tricks on me. I had fallen asleep after a long day of hiking, my legs sore, my back sticky with sweat, and my head resting on a damp pillow because nothing really dries out there. Sometime in the middle of the night I woke up suddenly with that sharp discomfort that told me I needed to pee. It wasn't the kind of thing I could ignore and go back to sleep. I tried for a few minutes, but the pressure kept getting worse until I knew I had no choice but to get out. I unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The sound of the zipper seemed too loud in that still air. The others were asleep, their tents dark and motionless, the campfire long dead, leaving just a faint glow of embers that barely lit the clearing. The moon was out, though, hanging somewhere above the canopy, and through the breaks in the trees, enough light filtered down to let me see shapes, trees, the curve of the path, the outline of our gear stacked nearby. I slipped on my sandals and grabbed my small flashlight, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Out there, the dark was safer than the light sometimes. I walked a little way from the tents, following a narrow path that led toward a patch of more open ground. Every step felt exaggerated in the silence. The ground was soft and uneven, covered in layers of wet leaves that made faint squishing noises under my feet. The air felt thicker away from camp, the kind of heat that sticks to your skin. I found a spot behind some low brush, far enough from everyone that no one would hear me. I crouched down, trying not to touch anything because everything in that forest seemed to crawl or sting or bite. I kept my balance awkwardly, holding myself just above the ground, focusing on getting it over with. That was when I started to feel it. that strange weight of awareness when you know something is behind you. I froze for a second, still half squatting, my breath caught in my throat. I hadn't heard anything at first, but then there was a faint shuffle, like something heavy brushing against leaves or branches. I told myself it was just my imagination, maybe a monkey or a small animal moving through the brush, but the sound came again, slow, heavy steps, not the quick, darting kind small animals make. Each one pressed into the ground with a low, muffled crunch. Whatever it was close. Very close. I tried to stay still and listen. The night was alive with noise, but this sound stood out, slow and deliberate, the rhythm almost human but heavier. The air around me felt tighter, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, quick and hard. I turned my head slightly, but I couldn't see much. Everything was shadows layered over shadows. I could make out faint movement, the suggestion of something large behind a line of trees about 20 feet away. My mind started running through what it could be. A jaguar maybe, or a tapir, or even a person. None of those ideas made me feel better. The sound stopped suddenly, and that silence was worse than the noise. It felt like whatever it was had noticed me too, and it was waiting. I realized how exposed I was. Half naked, crouched, defenseless. My muscles were shaking, partly from fear and partly from the uncomfortable position I was stuck in. I forced myself to finish as fast as I could, every second feeling like it might be the last. I could hear my breathing now, quick and shallow, and I was sure if I could hear it, then so could whatever was out there. When I finally stood up, I almost lost my balance. I pulled my shorts up with shaking hands and tried to stay quiet, but even the sound of the fabric felt loud. The forest around me seemed to shift again, like it was reacting to my movement. I caught a faint sound, a deep exhale, almost like a sigh or a snort, heavy and wet. That was enough for me. I didn't look back. I just started moving toward the camp, slow at first and then faster, until I was almost running, trying not to make too much noise but unable to stop myself. I could feel something watching me the whole way back, like eyes burning into my back. When I reached the camp, I didn't even use the zipper properly. I just dove inside my tent and pulled the flap closed, shaking so badly that my fingers couldn't grab the fabric. I sat there in the dark, holding my breath, listening. The sounds outside seemed to go back to normal after a while. Insects, frogs, the faint rustle of leaves, but I knew something had been there. I didn't sleep again that night. I just stayed awake, staring at the roof of the tent, waiting for the faint light of morning. When dawn finally came, I stepped outside. The air was cooler and a light mist hung between the trees. The others were starting to wake up, moving around, making breakfast. I walked back to where I had gone the night before, half expecting to find nothing and half dreading what I might see. The ground was disturbed, the wet leaves pushed aside in a wide path, as if something large had moved through. There were prints, not clear enough to make out every detail, but big, round impressions, wider than my hand, spaced too far apart for a human stride. The edges were still sharp, meaning they were fresh. I stood there staring at them, trying to figure it out. It could have been a tapir, maybe a jaguar. Both moved through these areas at night. But I kept thinking about how deliberate those steps had sounded, slow and careful, as if it knew I was there and didn't want to startle me, just wanted to watch. The thought made my skin crawl. I never told anyone what happened. I didn't want them to laugh or think I was scared of nothing. But I knew what I felt that night. Something big and alive had come close enough that I could hear it breathing. Something that had stopped when I stopped, that had waited for me to move before it moved again. Even now, I still think about it sometimes. That feeling of being small and helpless in that endless forest, of knowing that you're just one heartbeat away from something you can't see but that can see you perfectly. Out there in the dark, the line between being alive and being gone is paper thin. I don't know what it was that night, but I know it wasn't my imagination. In a place like that, you don't need ghosts to be afraid. The real things out there are enough. I spent a few nights camping in Sequoia National Park last year, deep in one of the quieter sections away from the popular sites. I drove up a long dirt road until I found a pull-out spot that looked over a small valley. It wasn't an official campsite, just a flat spot where the trees opened up enough for me to park my truck and set up for the night. The air was cool and still, and the sound of insects was the only thing moving through the trees. It was one of those places that felt both calm and uneasy at the same time. I could hear the forest breathing, if that makes any sense, and it made me feel small being out there alone. I had been camping plenty of times before, but there was something about those woods that felt different. The light seemed to die faster in the evening, and once the sun dropped, the forest turned into a solid wall of dark. Before going to sleep, I climbed up on a large boulder behind my truck to look at the stars. The sky there was unbelievable. Layers of stars that felt almost too close, like if you reached out you could scrape your hand against them. While I was up there, I noticed shallow depressions carved into the surface of the rock, some bowl-shaped, some long and thin like grooves. They looked old, weathered, but clear enough to see what they were. I recognized them as mortar bowls and sharpening grooves, marks left behind by Native American tribes that once lived in that area. There were dozens of them, spread unevenly across the rock's flat top, and I found myself tracing their edges with my fingers. It felt strange, touching something that old, something that had seen hundreds of years pass by in silence. I sat there for a long time, just listening to the wind slide through the trees and the small animals moving through the brush. When I finally climbed down and settled in the bed of my truck, I left the tailgate open so I could see the trees and sky from where I lay. I remember feeling unusually tired, heavier than normal, almost like my body was sinking into the sleeping bag. I must have fallen asleep right away, though it didn't feel like sleep when it started. It felt more like slipping into another place without realizing it. At first I thought I woke up. It was dark, but it wasn't the same dark I'd fallen asleep in. My eyes were open, but everything around me looked off. Familiar shapes, but not where they should have been. I wasn't in the back of my truck anymore. I was lying flat on the ground, wrapped up in my sleeping bag, the cold dirt pressing against my spine. The air was heavy and wet, and I could smell the forest floor, the rot of leaves, and something else. Something sweet but sickening, like blood or decay. I didn't understand how I got there. I didn't remember moving or hearing anything. When I turned my head to the left, I saw a movement. At first I thought it was water flowing, but then I saw the shapes. It was a mass of black, slick things writhing over one another, moving in a slow, rippling wave across the ground. I squinted, and the shapes came into focus. Snakes. Dozens, maybe hundreds of them, slithering together in a twisting column that stretched across the forest floor. The way they moved made my stomach turn. They looked like eels, slick and glistening, their bodies sliding against each other in a way that seemed to pulse like one living thing. I couldn't hear them, which made it worse. There was no hissing, no rustling, just silent, shifting motion. Then, out of the center of that mass, a rattlesnake lifted its head. Its body was thicker, its scales darker, and I could see the faint ring of its rattle as it coiled and faced me. I froze. The snake struck toward my leg, hitting the outside of my sleeping bag. I felt the pressure of its body and the sound of the rattle buzzing violently near my ear. I kicked hard, trying to get it away, and it disappeared back into the writhing flow of snakes, swallowed up like it had never been there. My chest was pounding, and I tried to move, but my limbs felt weak, like my body wasn't listening to me. I turned my head to follow where the snakes were going, and that's when I saw what they were crawling into. Just a few feet away from where I lay, there was a large black horse lying on its side. At first I thought it was dead, but its body twitched in slow spasms, like something was moving inside it. Its stomach was split open from chest to hindquarters, and the snakes were sliding into the open cavity, disappearing into the dark hollow of its gut. The sight of it made my whole body tense. Its skin was stretched tight, the muscles around the wound quivering as the snakes pushed deeper inside. I could see the glint of wet organs and the slow movement of the mass underneath the flesh, like the horse's insides were alive again. I don't remember breathing. I just stared, frozen, until a sound, a sharp, wet crack, came from the horse's ribs. That was enough to snap me awake. I jolted upright in my truck, gasping, the cold air hitting my face hard. My heart was racing so fast it felt like my chest was going to split. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag expecting to see something out there, but it was quiet. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees again. The forest looked exactly how it had before I went to sleep. My flashlight was still on the tailgate, untouched, and everything around me was where I left it. But my body was covered in sweat, and my hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the light steady. The rest of that night I didn't sleep. I sat in the cab of the truck with the doors locked, staring at the dark line of trees and waiting for the sun to rise. When morning finally came, I climbed back up to that boulder where I'd been the night before. The mortar bowls were still there, filled with bits of pine needles and small stones, and the grooves still ran across the surface like scars. I stood there for a long time, trying to shake off what had happened. It was easy to say it was just a dream, but it hadn't felt like one. It had felt real. The smell, the cold, the texture of the ground, even the weight of the snake hitting my leg. I packed up my gear not long after that and drove out of the park. I didn't stop to look around or take pictures like I usually would. The whole way down, I kept thinking about those carvings in the rock. I'm not a superstitious person, never have been, but I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe the place itself had something to do with it. Those carvings had been there for hundreds of years, made by people who lived and worked in that same spot, grinding their food, sharpening tools, leaving behind marks of their lives. Maybe that place held something, some weight or memory that still lingered. It's been a year since that trip, and I've never had another dream like it. But sometimes when I close my eyes at night, I still see that mass of snakes moving silently through the dirt. I still see the split belly of that horse, and I still wake up with my heart racing, half expecting to find myself back in that forest again, lying in the dirt with the sound of nothing all around me. I've camped in plenty of places since then, but I've never gone back to Sequoia. I don't think I ever will. It was the first morning of deer season, and the air in western Wisconsin had that kind of cold that bites through your gloves and makes your breath hang in front of you. The woods around my cousin's land were covered in a light frost, the kind that makes every step crunch faintly, even when you're trying to walk quietly. My cousin owned a good amount of land out there, rolling hills, thick stretches of oak and pine, and long ridges that seemed to twist endlessly. It had been a tradition for years that we'd all hunt there, my dad, my cousin, some of his friends. They had built a small shack years ago at the base of one of the ridges, rough lumber nailed together and insulated just enough to keep the heat from escaping too fast. Inside, it smelled like coffee, gun oil, and damp boots. That morning, it was just my dad and me. The others hadn't shown up yet, but we stuck to the usual rule, marking on the sheet which area we'd be hunting in. My dad's handwriting was a shaky scrawl, marking Hill 3 on the map that hung on the wall. We took the ATV up the narrow trail that wound through the timber, headlights cutting through the half-dark. It was still early and the sun hadn't crested the ridge yet, just a pale blue glow pushing through the mist that hovered low in the valleys. The woods were dead quiet except for the hum of the ATV. When we killed the engine, the silence was almost thick. We sat in our spots for a long time, waiting for that first bit of light to spill through the trees. The frost melted off branches slowly, dripping in tiny beads that tapped on leaves. Around 9 a.m., the cold had settled deep into my bones and nothing had moved all morning. Not a deer, not even a squirrel. It was strange. Usually, even if you didn't see deer, you'd at least hear life. The occasional crow or a chipmunk rustling through the leaves. But that morning, it was like the woods were holding their breath. We decided to call it for a bit and head back for coffee. I followed behind my dad down the narrow path that led back to the ATV. We moved slow, partly to listen for movement and partly because the ground was slick with thawing frost. Every few steps my dad would pause to listen and I'd do the same. The forest had that weird stillness where every sound you make feels too loud. I've always walked in sync with my dad when we hunt. It's something he taught me years ago. If we walk in rhythm, it sounds like one person instead of two, which keeps us quieter and less noticeable to deer. So when he stepped, I stepped. When he stopped, I stopped. But halfway down the hill, I started hearing something that didn't match our steps. It wasn't loud, just faint crunches behind us. At first, I thought it was the echo of our own feet bouncing off the trees, but after a few more steps, I realized it was slightly off-timed. It wasn't matching us, it was copying us. I froze for a second, listening. My dad kept walking a few paces ahead and I heard it again. The same pattern of steps, stopping when we did, starting when we moved. The air felt heavier all of a sudden. I turned around slowly, scanning the woods behind me. The trees up the slope were thick and close together, trunks gray and dark with moisture. The light was dim under the canopy, and the mist hung low enough to blur the distance. I didn't see anything, but the sound had stopped the moment I turned. I tried to shake it off. There were plenty of animals that could make that kind of noise. Deer, coyotes, maybe even another hunter who got mixed up about which area was taken. But something about it didn't feel like that. The woods were too still. I kept following my dad down, trying to ignore it, but the sound started again. Crunch, crunch, stop. Crunch, crunch, stop. Always matching my pace. When I looked over my shoulder again, I caught movement between two trees. It was fast, something pale darting behind a trunk about 30 yards up the hill. I stared, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my neck. Then I saw it again, a face peeking out from behind the tree. It wasn't an animal. It was a person or something close to one. The skin looked pale, almost gray, and stretched tight over sharp cheekbones. It ducked back behind the tree when I stared. I stood there frozen, my breath shallow. Then, slowly, it peeked again. Same face, same unmoving eyes fixed right on me. For a second, I couldn't move. The light had shifted just enough that I could see the outline of its shoulder and part of its arm. Thin, bony, almost twisted. It didn't move the way a person would. It stayed behind the tree, half hidden, like it didn't want to come fully into the open. My dad must have noticed I wasn't following him anymore because he stopped and turned. When he looked up the hill, his whole expression changed. He didn't say much, just motioned for me to move. I didn't look away as I backed down toward the trail, my boots slipping on the damp ground. When my dad started up the ATV, the sound of the engine seemed to wake the woods back up. I saw the figure step out from behind the tree then, just a little more of it. Its shoulder rolled forward, and the shape of its body looked wrong, like one side didn't line up right with the other. It was thin, not wearing much, and its skin had that strange pale tone that didn't look right for daylight. It just stood there watching, head tilted slightly, like it was studying us. The moment the ATV roared louder, my dad gunned it, and I grabbed on tight. We tore down the hill, the trees blurring past. I didn't look back until we were almost to the shack. When I did, I couldn't see it anymore, just the empty hillside and the trees standing still again. The sun was finally breaking through and the frost was melting fast, steam rising in small wisps from the ground. When we got back to the shack, nobody else was there yet. The door creaked open, and I remember my hands shaking as I poured a cup of coffee, trying to steady myself. My dad didn't say much at all. He just stared out the small window toward the tree line, like he was trying to make sense of what we saw. After a few minutes, he said we were heading home. We loaded up and left the woods behind, and I didn't ask questions. I didn't go back that season. My dad did, though. He got a deer later that week and acted like nothing happened. When I asked if he ever saw anything strange again, he just said no and changed the subject. But I can't forget it. Every time I think about those woods, I remember that pale face looking down at us, standing dead still in the cold morning air. Over the next few months, I tried to explain it to myself. Maybe it was some lost hunter, someone who wandered onto the property and was too scared to call out. But the more I replayed it, the less that made sense. It wasn't wearing orange or any kind of gear, and there wasn't a sound when it moved except for those steps that matched ours. The land is fenced in and posted miles from any public access. You can't just stumble in there. And that body, the way the shoulders hung uneven, the way it ducked back like it didn't know how to move right, it wasn't normal. I haven't been back to that hill since. I still hunt, but never on that property. Even now, when I walk through the woods in the early morning and hear the leaves crunch under my boots, I can't help but listen for that extra set of footsteps, the faintest echo that doesn't belong to me. The woods always feel a little different now, Like there's something out there that knows exactly how to move when you move, that waits just far enough away for you to start doubting what you heard. But I know what I saw that morning, and every quiet stretch of forest reminds me that some things don't need to be explained to be real. I had worked in that park long enough to know that fear came in many shapes. Sometimes it was sudden, like the snap of a twig or the rush of air that followed a bear bursting from the brush. Other times it was slow, like the tightening feeling in your gut when you realized you were too far from help and too close to something that didn't care if you lived or died. The park was big, rugged, full of salmon-choked rivers and thick valleys where sound barely traveled. It had a way of humbling you. It reminded you every so often that no matter how trained or experienced you thought you were, nature didn't care. The first time it got me good was early one morning on a remote riverside camp. I'd set up my tent close enough to the water to hear the steady flow through the night. It was peaceful, at least until I woke up to the sound of something heavy splashing in the river. At first I thought maybe a tree had fallen or a moose had crossed upstream. But the rhythm of the splashing wasn't random. It was steady, powerful, moving straight toward my camp. I lay there in the dark, half inside my sleeping bag, trying to control my breathing. Then I heard the wet sound of something climbing up the bank. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I didn't need to look to know what it was. The only animals that moved like that around here were bears, big ones. I could hear the water dripping off its fur, the grunt of its breath. The only thing between me and it was a thin layer of fabric and a few feet of open air. My hand found the can of bear spray beside me. I didn't move, didn't unzip the tent, just waited. After a minute that felt like 10, the sound faded, the bear moving downriver, maybe catching a whiff of fish somewhere else. When I finally exhaled, my heart felt like it had been clamped in a fist. I didn't sleep after that. I just sat in the dark, waiting for dawn. A few weeks later, I was out doing survey work on a narrow game trail about 20 miles from camp. It was late morning, cloudy and damp, and the air smelled like wet earth and pine. I'd been walking for a couple of hours, stopping every few hundred meters to take notes. When I finally stopped to rest, I heard it, a faint rustle behind me. I froze. Then came a soft, unmistakable huffing sound, the kind that only one kind of animal makes when it's close and trying to figure you out. I turned my head slowly and saw them. A sow and her cub, no more than 15 meters behind me, standing in the brush. The cub was small, probably born that spring. The mother's eyes were locked on me, her nose working the air. My tracks must have led them right to me. For a few seconds, none of us moved. She sniffed again, took a step forward, then stopped. I could see her muscles tense, her ears forward. My entire body went cold. I'd been trained for this, knew the drill, but in that moment, training didn't mean much. I could feel every heartbeat echoing in my chest. After a long stare, she turned, nudged her cub, and walked back into the trees. The cub hesitated, watching me, then followed. I didn't move for another 5 minutes. When I did, I went straight back to camp, every sound behind me making me turn my head. The next scare came later that summer. I'd been camping near a river bend, not far from an old moose cache that someone had left behind, bones scattered across the gravel. I remember boating past it earlier that day, thinking something had been feeding on it recently. That night I woke to the sound of grunting near the tent. Heavy breathing, short, rough sounds. I unzipped just enough of the flap to see a dark shape moving between the trees. It was a boar, a big one, and he didn't look right. He was limping, his flank caked with dried blood. I could tell he'd been in a fight, maybe defending a carcass. I banged on a pot, tried to haze him off. He backed away into the shadows. For a second, I thought that was it, but then he came back. I yelled again, louder this time, banged harder. He turned, walked off, then circled back again, pacing at the edge of the clearing. Over and over. Every time I thought he was gone, the brush would move again, and he'd be there. It went on like that for half an hour until finally he limped off downriver for good. I didn't sleep at all that night either. In the morning, I found deep tracks all around my tent, claw marks in the soil. He'd been close enough to touch the nylon, but it wasn't always animals. Sometimes it was the land itself that scared you. Once I spent 2 full days stuck in a plywood cabin during a willowaw. The wind didn't stop for 48 hours, just screamed across the ridges and hammered the building like it wanted to rip it apart. Loose pumice flew through the air and slammed against the walls, the sound sharp and constant. Each hit made the wood shudder. Inside, I could feel the whole structure flex with each gust. It was the kind of storm that made you feel small, insignificant. There was no sleeping, no resting, just waiting. Every so often, I'd step outside for a second, crouched against the wall to make sure the roof was still holding. When the storm finally broke, the landscape looked like it had been scraped raw. Every surface was coated with grit, every loose thing gone. My ears rang from the wind for hours afterward. Another time, I had to cross a glacial river alone with a 50-pound pack. The water was high, milky with silt, the current fast enough to pull a grown man under if he misjudged a step. There was no bridge, no easy way around. I had to go. I took it slow, every step deliberate, my trekking pole shaking under the weight of the current. The water was ice cold, numbing my legs to the bone. One slip and I'd be swept away. The sound of it was deafening, like the earth itself was rushing past. I kept my eyes on the far bank, breathing through my teeth, feeling my boots slide over smooth stones. When I finally reached the other side, I collapsed on the gravel, my legs shaking so bad I couldn't stand for a while. I looked back at that river, the pale gray surface, and knew I'd just gotten lucky. But the scariest moment, the one that still makes my stomach drop, happened a few months later. I was flying back from a supply run in a single-engine plane. The park stretched out below, endless wilderness, rivers like silver threads, forests like green oceans. It was calm, perfect visibility, nothing unusual. Then, somewhere over the foothills, I felt a sputter. Just one at first, then another. The engine coughed, shuddered, and then cut out completely. The silence that followed didn't feel real. It was the kind of silence that only happens when something vital stops working. I stared at the gauges, empty tank. I'd misjudged the fuel burn. My stomach dropped into my boots. Below me were miles of trees, ridges, no open ground in sight. The plane started to lose altitude fast. I could feel the air pressure change, the nose tilting downward. I knew the odds. A forced landing out here rarely ends well. I trimmed the controls, leveled the wings, searched for anything, an opening, a river bar, anything flat. Finally I saw it, a narrow stretch of gravel near a bend in the river. I aimed for it, trying to ignore the trees flashing past underneath. The ground came up hard and fast. The impact threw me forward, the plane skidding and jolting to a stop just short of the water. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unbuckle my harness. I stumbled out, the air thick with the smell of fuel and scorched metal. I sat there on the gravel for a long time, the river rushing beside me, the plane silent and broken behind me. I'd had close calls before, but that one was different. It stripped away every illusion I had about control, about safety. Out there, in that park full of bears and storms and rivers that could swallow you whole, you learned something real. You weren't in charge. You never had been. You were just passing through, lucky to walk away each time the wild decided to give you another chance. I was around 8 or 9 when I found the hand. My mom used to take me out to a reservoir she liked, somewhere near a national park, though I can't remember which one anymore. It was one of those places with long stretches of rocky shoreline, a few trees scattered here and there, and water that looked calm from a distance but had a strange green tint up close. She made baskets and things out of materials she found in the woods, reeds, bark, grasses, and I went along to help collect. She used to give me a nickel for every piece of trash I picked up. That was her way of keeping me busy and teaching me to take care of the land at the same time. It was one of those hot summer days where everything smelled like damp mud and pine needles. The air was still, no wind at all, and the waterline had that stale smell that reservoirs get when the water sits too long. I remember carrying 2 things, a woven basket for the stuff my mom needed and a plastic grocery bag for the trash. She was down the shore a ways, cutting reeds near a shallow spot, and I was walking along the rocks looking for soda cans and bits of plastic. I found a few beer bottles, some old fishing line tangled around a stick. A broken pair of sunglasses. I remember being proud because my bag was half full already. The rocks were slippery in places and I had to crouch down every so often to steady myself. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was a glove, a beige or light brown work glove, lying half buried in the wet sand right where the water line met the shore. It looked swollen, like it had been soaked for a long time. The fingers were curled slightly, and there was a darker patch near the wrist that I thought was just mud. I bent down and grabbed it. The skin was soft and slick, not like fabric at all, and when I lifted it, I saw the inside of the wrist, bone, muscle, everything. The skin just ended there. The smell hit me next, a thick, sour smell that made my stomach twist. I remember screaming, but what I remember even more clearly was that I didn't drop it. My fingers locked around it, like my brain couldn't tell my hand to open. It was heavier than I expected and pale and bloated from the water. My mom came running after she heard me, but I barely remember that part. I remember her pulling at my hands, prying my fingers open one by one until it fell back into the mud. I can still hear the sound it made when it hit, a soft, wet slap. She took me by the shoulders and led me back to the car. I don't even remember walking there. It was the early 90s before we had cell phones, so we drove to a gas station, maybe 15 minutes away, and used the payphone to call the police. I remember her voice shaking as she talked to them. They went back out to collect what I'd found. Later, I overheard that it belonged to a teenager who'd been hit by a boat propeller a few days before. They said he'd fallen off while drinking with friends and the current had carried pieces of him toward the shore. I guess I found one of them. The officers tried to tell me it was probably an animal paw, maybe a bear, but I knew it wasn't. I'd seen fingernails. I didn't talk for 2 months after that. My mom said it was shock, but it wasn't just fear. It was the feeling of how fragile everything was. How something so normal, like a summer day by the lake, could suddenly become something you'd remember for the rest of your life for the worst reason. Even now, decades later, I can't stand the smell of lake water. If it's still or warm, I have to walk away. I can't look at dead fish or roadkill without my hands tensing up. My body remembers what my mind tries not to. Years later, when I was in college, I decided to go hiking alone. It had been a rough semester, and I thought being out in nature again would help. I picked an area in southwestern Colorado, somewhere quiet, somewhere that would make me feel small in a good way. I brought a small tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and planned to stay 2 nights. It was early spring, the air cold enough to see your breath in the morning, but warm in the afternoons. The trail wound through pine and juniper, with long views of red cliffs in the distance. I remember feeling good at first, tired, but calm. The kind of quiet that only exists miles away from other people. But on the second day, while I was making my way back, I heard voices coming from ahead on the trail. A group of hikers laughing, talking loud. I'd gone out there for solitude and I didn't want to see anyone, so I stepped off the path and decided to wait until they passed. I walked a bit deeper into the trees, far enough that I couldn't see the trail anymore. That's when the woods started to change. It got darker, thicker. The branches were closer together, and there were bones on the ground, small ones at first. Rabbit, bird, maybe deer. I thought it was just the remains of some predator's kills. I kept walking, thinking I'd find a spot to sit for a while. Then I saw something that made me stop. In a small clearing was a kind of structure, maybe 4 feet tall, made entirely of bones. It looked like a table or an altar, something someone had built on purpose. There were skulls, ribs, and leg bones all arranged in careful order. Some were tied together with strips of old leather. Around it, hanging from branches, were strings of bones and bits of metal, like wind chimes, but they didn't make any sound. Everything was still. There was no blood, nothing fresh, but the smell of old decay hung in the air, faint but there. I could tell some of the bones had been there a long time, bleached white by the sun, while others looked newer, darker. The ground was disturbed around it, like people had walked there recently. I remember the strange feeling that whoever made it might still be nearby, watching. I didn't think. I just turned and walked back the way I came, trying to retrace my steps. The woods felt different on the way out. Every branch scrape sounded louder, every shadow longer. When I finally found the trail again, I didn't stop walking until I reached my car. I didn't even take my backpack off before I started driving. I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never went camping again after that. I still hike sometimes, but only on crowded trails, the kind with signs and other people around. I don't know who built that altar or why, and I don't want to know. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I think about the hand I picked up when I was a kid and the bones arranged in that clearing, and I realize they feel connected somehow. Not because of anything supernatural, but because they both showed me that even in the quietest, most peaceful places, there's always something underneath, a part of life and death that most people never see. I've learned to keep my distance from it. I think that's why I've managed to sleep at night since then. It was my first time ever camping, and I already hated every second of it. It was a field trip for 7th grade, and I had no idea why anyone thought it would be fun. We drove almost 5 hours from home, packed into a school bus that smelled like chips and sweat. The teachers tried to make it sound exciting, saying we'd get to learn about nature and teamwork, but all I could think about was how far away from my bed I was. I wasn't an outdoor kid. I liked my room, my books, my stuff. I didn't like dirt, bugs, or sleeping in a place that didn't have walls thicker than paper. The cabin they put us in was nothing like what I imagined when they said cabin. It looked old and uneven, like it had been built out of leftover wood someone found lying around. The bunks were rough and creaked if you breathed too hard. The mattress felt like it was stuffed with straw. There were about 10 of us in there, all lined up with our sleeping bags, and the air smelled like mildew and bug spray. Everyone else fell asleep fast, laughing a little before they drifted off, but I just lay there staring at the dark ceiling. I could hear everything: the wind scraping the trees, someone snoring, something small moving around under the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was just mice, but the sound of them scratching against the floorboards made my skin crawl. I turned over again and again, trying to get comfortable, but the wooden cot dug into my shoulder blades. I could hear my heart beating louder than anything else. I hated how far I was from home, how quiet it all was, how I couldn't even see the lights of a town anywhere beyond the tree line. I remember thinking if I could just make it to morning, I'd never complain about my room again. But the night just wouldn't end. Every minute felt like an hour. Finally, I gave up trying to sleep. I had brought one of my Christopher Pike books with me. I was obsessed with those back then, and I figured reading might distract me. I had a little clip-on book light I'd begged my mom to buy for the trip. I grabbed it, slipped out of my sleeping bag as quietly as I could, and went to the cabin door. The floorboards groaned under my weight, and I froze, watching the shadows to see if anyone woke up. No one moved. I turned the handle slowly and stepped outside. The air was cold enough that it made my breath visible, even though it was late spring. The camp was dead quiet. Somewhere way off, I could hear water trickling, probably the creek they said we'd hike to in the morning. But everything else was still. The cabins were spread out, and I could see faint light from 1 or 2 windows down the hill where the teachers were sleeping. I sat down on the front step with my book and turned on the light. It made a small, pale circle on the pages, and for a few minutes that was all that existed: me, the light, and the words. But after a while, I started to notice how heavy the darkness was around me. It wasn't like the dark inside a room. This felt alive somehow, like it was pressing in from all sides. I tried to ignore it, but something in me kept making me look up. The trees surrounded the cabin in thick walls, black shapes against the night sky. I couldn't see beyond them. Every time I looked up, I half expected to see someone, or something, standing there. The hairs on my neck were up, and I couldn't explain why. There wasn't any noise. No footsteps, no rustling, just that weird feeling that something was near. I told myself it was my imagination, that I was just tired and jumpy. But then I shifted the book in my hands and the light moved across the ground, and that's when I saw them. 2 small round reflections staring back at me, eyes, glowing gold for just a second before I realized what I was looking at. My body locked up completely. I dropped the book and the light rolled onto its side, shining across the dirt. The eyes didn't move. They blinked once, slow, and that's when I saw the shape. It wasn't a person. It was low to the ground, but big. I followed the outline upward. The way the shoulder curved, the way the head tilted slightly. A mountain lion. I had never seen one before, only pictures, but I knew right away. It was maybe 10 or 12 feet away, right at the bottom of the steps. It was so close I could see its whiskers catching bits of the light. Its body was tense, its tail twitching once behind it. I could feel the air change, like everything else stopped moving, just to watch what was about to happen. My chest hurt from holding my breath. All I could think was that if I made a sound, I'd be dead. My brain started flashing random thoughts. My parents, my bed, the stupid book I'd dropped, my teacher's face if I didn't show up for breakfast. I knew in that strange way you just know that I wasn't supposed to move. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. My hands were shaking and I could feel the edge of the door frame just behind me. I kept inching one hand back, slow enough that it didn't make a sound, until I felt the cold metal of the handle. The lion's eyes didn't leave mine. It was like we were both waiting for the other to do something first. My fingers slipped twice on the handle because of sweat, but then I got a grip and turned it. The door made a soft click and the lion's head moved just slightly, its ears flicking forward. That tiny movement was enough to break whatever freeze I was in. I threw my weight back, fell into the cabin and slammed the door shut as quietly as I could manage. My heart was beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't even care that I'd dropped the book outside. I crawled back into my bunk, pulled the sleeping bag up to my chin, and stared at the wall. I didn't sleep at all. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind outside, I thought was it coming back. By the time the sky started to get light, I was still awake, staring at the faint lines of sunlight through the window. One of the girls got up to use the bathroom and noticed the door wasn't fully closed, asked if it had been windy. I just said yeah. When the teacher came by to wake us, she asked whose book was outside, lying in the dirt. I said it was mine and got scolded for leaving school property out overnight. Everyone laughed. I just nodded and didn't say a word. Later that morning while we were hiking, I noticed tracks near the edge of camp. They were big, round, clean prints with deep claw marks where the ground was soft. I didn't tell anyone what I saw because I didn't want to explain why I'd been outside. But the whole time, I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet that lion had been. How it could have taken one step up those stairs and no one would have ever known until morning. When the trip finally ended, and I got home, I unpacked everything and found pine needles still stuck in my clothes. I put the book on my shelf, and for weeks after, I kept waking up in the middle of the night thinking I saw eyes outside my window. I never went camping again after that, and even now, years later, when I'm driving through places with woods that stretch for miles, I still get that same feeling. That quiet kind of fear that something's out there, watching, waiting. So still you'd never know it was there until it was already too late. I was working in Yellowstone for the summer, a seasonal ranger assigned mostly to patrol and maintenance duties. And that summer had stretched longer than I expected. Most days were routine, filled with checking campgrounds, picking up trash, and making sure people weren't wandering into dangerous areas. Nights were different, though. Nights had a stillness to them that you couldn't quite describe until you were out there alone, miles from anything resembling civilization. The kind of stillness that made your own thoughts echo louder than usual. It was on one of those nights that I found myself driving back into the park after a long shift. The sky was clear, stars like pinpricks of light in the dark, and the road ahead twisted through dense forest and open meadows. The quiet was almost too quiet, the kind that made every sound, wind in the pines, the occasional snapping of a twig, feel magnified. As I rounded a bend, my headlights caught a scene that made me slam the brakes. A car was stopped in the middle of the road, the front end crushed and crumpled against a massive bison. The car's lights were still on, casting a harsh yellow glow across the black pavement and the animal, which was struggling to stand, its legs trembling, massive body heaving. The bison was alive but clearly injured, swaying and twitching in a way that made my stomach twist. My first instinct was to check for the driver, but the car was empty. There was no sign of anyone around. No footprints, no body stumbling through the woods. Just the sound of the bison breathing, deep, ragged, and loud in the silence, and the faint hum of the car's engine. I parked a safe distance away and tried to process what I was seeing. Logically, I knew a few possibilities. The driver might have stumbled off to get help, maybe had a cell phone that worked somewhere deeper in the park. Or another person could have picked them up. Yellowstone is massive, and in those areas you can go miles without seeing another car. The nearest station was over 15 minutes away, and even then, cell service was patchy at best. It was the middle of the night, and the idea of someone bleeding and making their way through that wilderness by themselves made a pit open in my stomach. The trees on either side were thick and dark, shadows stretching across the road, hiding whatever might be lurking beyond. My hands gripped the wheel tighter than I realized. I sat there for a few moments, engine idling, trying to decide my next move. The bison was still alive, but clearly in pain. Its breath came out in shallow, rattling gasps, and its muscles twitched involuntarily. I didn't have any tranquilizers with me, no way to safely move the animal. I couldn't leave the car in the middle of the road either. Other wildlife, other drivers, whoever else happened to be on this road, could get hurt. But the thought of approaching it made my heart race. Bison are massive and unpredictable, and a cornered animal can kill in an instant. I kept my distance, horn ready just in case, and tried to calm myself. The headlights illuminated every ripple of muscle, every twitch of the tail, and the sound of its labored breathing filled the small space of my truck. It was impossible to ignore the life inside the massive beast, and impossible not to wonder what had happened to the driver. After a few minutes, I realized I couldn't do much there. There was no point in lingering, no way to safely help the bison without assistance, and no way to know where the driver had gone. I took a deep breath, shoving my fear and unease down into the pit of my stomach, and pulled back onto the road slowly, keeping my eyes on the bison as I drove. I made sure to stay on the opposite side of the road, giving it as much space as I could while inching past. My mind kept spinning with possibilities. The car wrecked, the driver hurt, maybe crawling through the dark, bleeding, lost. The idea of someone struggling alone in that wilderness, with nothing but the faint sound of the forest around them, made my skin crawl. Every shadow in the trees seemed to move just slightly, every branch snapping under the weight of an animal or wind feeling too close, too intentional. I drove on, the road twisting and turning, headlights cutting through the dark. The only sounds were the tires against asphalt, the wind brushing through the trees, and my own breath. 15 minutes later, I reached a small campground where there was a payphone that actually worked. I grabbed the receiver, my hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline, and dialed the emergency line for park services. I explained the location, gave the details of the car and the bison, and waited for confirmation that help was on the way. The operator assured me that rangers were being dispatched, and that someone would check both the vehicle and the surrounding area. Only then did I finally allow myself to lean back in the seat and exhale a long, shuddering breath. By the time I returned the following day to check on the scene, the car was gone, the bison had been taken care of by wildlife authorities, and there was no trace of what had happened to the driver beyond some blood on the pavement and tire marks leading into the trees. It wasn't a story of ghosts or the supernatural, just the raw, harsh reality of Yellowstone at night. An accident, an injured animal, and a driver whose experience we might never know. It stayed with me, though. The feeling of being alone in that darkness, the uncertainty of what had happened, the image of the bison twitching in the headlights. I never did find out if the driver was okay, but at least the emergency protocols worked. Someone eventually came to the scene, and everything that could be fixed was taken care of. That night taught me that sometimes the most terrifying moments aren't about monsters or legends. They're about real life. Fragile and unpredictable, in a wilderness that's indifferent to the struggles of a single human. Even now, years later, I think about that night. I remember the smell of the air, cold and sharp, the feel of my hands gripping the steering wheel, and the sight of the bison standing there in pain, alive but helpless. I'll never know exactly what happened to that driver, but I take comfort in knowing that the system eventually worked, and that I was able to at least get help on the way. It's a story I tell myself as a reminder that fear is natural, but action is what counts. even in the face of something as unknowable as the wilderness at night. I was 13 when my family discovered a camping spot that, at the time, felt like the most private, untouched place in the world. It was deep in a national park a few hours' drive from home, a place we'd return to almost every year, though always trying to find a new nook tucked away from other campers. My parents loved the old logging roads, the ones that twist and disappear into thick overgrowth, the ones that were too rough for ordinary cars. We didn't have four-wheel drive back then, so the last mile or two was always a slog on foot, hauling tents, sleeping bags, coolers, and food. That year we found a hill between two large ponds, the kind of spot where you feel like the world stops just for you. The first evening was magical. Dragonflies danced above the water, frogs croaked in the distance, and the smell of pine and wet earth filled the air. We set up camp on the slope between the ponds, the water shimmering faintly under the setting sun. Everything seemed perfect. Night fell, and the pond's chorus swelled. Frogs of every size and shape called out, their songs overlapping into this strange, comforting cacophony. We stayed close to the fire, toasting marshmallows and listening. By 2 a.m. the world was completely quiet except for that distant frog chorus. And then it wasn't quiet anymore. Out of the blackness, two enormous trucks tore down the logging road toward our camp. They weren't like anything I'd seen. Each was packed full of people, more than seemed possible to fit inside. They didn't slow down. They didn't shine headlights directly at us. They didn't even acknowledge our presence. My parents shouted. I think my dad cursed. But the trucks barreled past without a second glance, stopping only a few hundred feet from the pond. The people poured out and waded into the water. I remember the movement perfectly, the way they stepped silently through the shallow ponds, nets in hand, not saying a word. It was eerie. They skimmed the surface of the water over and over. From the hill, it looked almost like a slow, coordinated dance. The frogs, once abundant and loud, were being lifted from the water silently. No splashes, no sound of struggle, just a swift disappearance. It lasted for over an hour. I tried to make sense of it. Frog farming, some kind of research, maybe illegal poaching, but nothing fit. Not a single flashlight, not a single conversation, just methodical movement. The trucks then loaded up and roared back down the logging road as quickly as they had come. The ponds, once alive with croaks, fell completely silent. The next morning, we walked down to the water and saw one lone frog, its leg bent at an awkward angle, trying to escape the empty silence around it. We gently carried it back to the pond, placing it near the reeds. It made a weak croak and disappeared beneath the surface. But even after that, the ponds never recovered during our trip. The frogs that had made the night come alive were gone, leaving only stillness. That memory stayed with me, not because it was frightening in the classic sense, but because it was unnatural and inexplicable. The way everything had just vanished in silence, leaving only emptiness, haunted me far more than any shadow or scream ever could. We returned to that spot a few times over the years. Never again did those trucks appear. Never again did the frogs disappear in the same eerie, mechanical way. The following year, we tried a different part of the same park, thinking that maybe staying further from logging roads would feel safer. It was a completely different experience. This time, I didn't have the unsettling feeling of invisible eyes watching us from the woods. Instead, it was raw, natural chaos that reminded you who really owns the forest. We parked our car near a slope that led down to a small clearing, the kind of space perfect for a family tent. We had a cooler with drinks and a separate container for food. One mistake, one small slip. Someone had left a pack of marshmallows open in the beer cooler, and the lid wasn't sealed properly. I went to sleep under a blanket of stars, the campfire dying to embers. I woke in the very early hours to movement, to a sense that something was near. At first I thought it was the wind or maybe a deer rummaging through the undergrowth. But then I saw it, a black bear, enormous, lumbering through our campsite. Its eyes caught the faint moonlight as it carried our cooler away, the sound of crushed aluminum echoing in the quiet forest. The marshmallows were gone, the beer cans squished beneath its weight. We tracked it carefully as the morning light crept over the hills. Not too close, not wanting to provoke it, but far enough to follow. Eventually, the bear disappeared into the denser woods, leaving behind the damaged cooler and the faint scent of its raid. We inspected the cooler, salvaged what we could, and learned a hard lesson about securing food in bear country. That trip ended with no more nighttime intrusions, no more surprises, just the smell of damp earth, pine, and campfire smoke. Both experiences, the silent frog hunters and the bear raid, taught me that the forest is full of strange, unexpected rules. Life continues on its own terms, often ignoring human presence entirely, sometimes in ways that feel unsettling, sometimes in ways that feel dangerous. Years later, I still think about that hill between the two ponds, the empty water and the silent disappearance of the frogs, and I still remember the morning after the bear stole our marshmallows, the weight of the forest pressing down, reminding us that no matter how careful you are, nature has its own rhythms and its own visitors. Both trips ended without injury, without disaster, but with a memory that shapes how I move through the wilderness. Respect the quiet, expect the unexpected, and understand that not everything in the forest is meant to be explained. I was driving home from Yosemite 4 years ago, late in the afternoon, around 5. The sun was still up, but low enough that everything had that long shadow look. I'd been hiking all day and was just trying to get back home before it got dark. I remember the air being dry, that dusty mountain smell mixing with the heat that still came off the road. My legs were sore and I had been drinking a ton of water all day, so somewhere along that long empty stretch, I pulled over to take a quick piss before the drive really got going again. There wasn't much traffic that time of day, maybe a car every few minutes. I pulled onto a little gravel shoulder off the highway where the trees thinned out a bit and got out of the truck. The forest on both sides of the road looked endless. Tall pines, dead branches scattered on the ground, and that strange quiet hum that fills mountain air when you're too far from anything else. I went maybe 15, 20 feet away from the truck, just enough to not be right on the road. I could still hear some birds somewhere out in the trees, those little chirps that come and go, but right in the middle of everything, they all stopped. Not one or two, but all of them at once. It was sudden and total, like someone had flipped a switch. I froze for a second, stilling my hand midstream. Because when you've been out in places like that, you learn to pay attention to silence. Birds stopped singing for a reason. My first thought was that a bear must be nearby. Yosemite has plenty, and this was close enough to their range that it made sense. I'd seen signs on the road earlier reminding people to keep food locked up and not to leave trash out. So, I zipped up fast and looked around, trying to spot any movement in the trees. I didn't see anything at first, but that silence made my stomach tighten. The air felt heavier, almost like it pressed in around me. I turned back toward my truck, maybe 30 feet away, and started walking quick. My heart was beating a little faster than I wanted to admit. I've been around bears before, and they make noise. You hear twigs snapping, low huffs, sometimes the thump of their steps. But this was just nothing. No noise. I got maybe halfway to the truck when it hit me. It was the loudest sound I've ever heard in my life. It came from somewhere in the trees to my right, maybe 50 yards in, maybe less. It wasn't like anything I could compare it to directly. It wasn't an animal sound, not in the way I've ever known them. It was deep but high at the same time, like layers of tones stacked over each other. The closest way to describe it would be like a scream mixed with an air raid siren, long, vibrating, shaking the air around me. I could feel it in my chest. My first instinct was to drop down, but fear took over, and instead I just ran. My legs started moving before I could think. I sprinted for the truck, gravel kicking up under my boots. Every step felt like it took too long. The sound cut off after a few seconds, but it echoed through the trees, bouncing around so it was hard to tell where it had come from. I reached the truck, yanked the door open, and got in so fast I almost slammed my knee into the steering column. My hands were shaking as I shoved the keys into the ignition. I remember my breathing was ragged, my whole body buzzing with adrenaline. I got it started, and right as I was about to shift into drive, it came again. Louder this time. Much closer. It didn't sound human. but it didn't sound like an animal either. It was too controlled, too long. The way it rose and fell, it almost had rhythm. Like it wasn't random noise, but something made on purpose. It didn't sound like any recording I've ever heard of cougars or bears or elk calls. It had this metallic undertone to it, almost like metal scraping against metal, or like a huge horn being blown through broken machinery. The air around the truck seemed to vibrate with it. I slammed the gear into drive and floored it, tires spitting gravel behind me. My mirrors showed nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of heat from the road, but I didn't look for long. I just kept going, eyes locked ahead. I must have driven 10 minutes straight before I finally slowed down enough to breathe normally again. My ears were still ringing, my pulse still racing. I kept checking my mirrors like something was going to come running down the highway after me. But it never did. When I finally stopped at a gas station miles later, I just sat there for a minute, gripping the steering wheel, trying to make sense of it. My brain kept going through possibilities: bear, cougar, elk, but none fit. I've spent a lot of time outdoors, camping, hiking, even volunteering with trail crews, and I've heard all kinds of animal sounds. Elk can sound eerie, especially during rutting season, but that's a hollow kind of call, not something that shakes your whole body. Cougars scream, but their sound doesn't carry like that, and bears mostly huff or growl. This was different. For weeks after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went online, listened to every recording I could find of wild animal calls from that region, trying to match what I'd heard. I listened to elk, mountain lions, bobcats, even foxes. They can make some strange noises, but nothing matched. There were people online talking about weird siren-like sounds in the mountains, saying it could be some kind of unclassified animal, maybe even distant mining equipment echoing through canyons. That one almost made sense, but there weren't any active operations anywhere near where I'd been. I checked maps and looked up old logging or construction sites, but nothing lined up with that location. After a while, I started wondering if it could have been a sound bouncing off the valley walls, something coming from miles away that got distorted on the wind. But the way it hit me in that moment, the way it felt so close, I knew it wasn't distant. It was right there, somewhere behind those trees. The air itself had moved with it. You can tell when sound travels far. It loses the sharpness, the vibration, but this one had both. Even now, years later, I think about that sound more than I should. It comes back when I'm driving alone at night, especially through wooded areas. Sometimes I roll down the window and listen to the quiet, waiting for it, half hoping I'll hear it again just to know what it was, half praying I never do. It's strange how one moment can get stuck in your head forever. I've told myself over and over that it had to be something explainable. Maybe it was a combination of sounds. A bear, a coyote, and some wind through the rocks blending together in a way that made it seem unnatural. Maybe the acoustics of the canyon just warped it into that awful tone. But deep down, I still don't fully believe that. I've never been scared of the woods, not really. But that day changed something in me. Now, whenever I have to pull over in a remote area, even just for a quick stop, I check my surroundings twice. I listen for birds, for wind, for anything alive. Because once you've heard the woods go completely silent like that, and you felt the air shake with a sound that doesn't belong to anything you know, it sticks with you. You can tell yourself it was normal, that it was something natural. But the truth is, sometimes nature makes noises that don't fit into what we understand. And that's what keeps me from ever stopping on a mountain road again. When I was around 10 years old, my family decided to take a weekend trip to Mark Twain National Forest in Missouri. It wasn't one of those organized camping trips with marked sites and friendly camp hosts. My stepfather insisted we could just drive off one of the forest roads, find a clearing, and pitch our tent there. He said it would be quieter, more authentic. I remember being in the back seat with my sister, watching the sunlight fade through the trees as the narrow road twisted deeper into the forest. The tall pines and oaks closed in on both sides, and every turn looked the same. It was late, much later than it should have been for setting up camp. My mom kept looking at the clock on the dashboard, her fingers tapping against her knee. My stepfather was already drinking from a can of beer, his arm hanging out the window. I remember the smell of it mixing with the scent of pine and dust. By the time we finally stopped, the sun was already dipping below the treetops. The light that was left came in streaks of orange through the branches. My stepfather pulled the car into a small clearing off the dirt road, the tires crunching over dried leaves and sticks. The place felt too quiet. There were no other cars, no sound of other campers, no sign of people at all. Just us and miles of forest. My mom and sister got out first, stretching their legs, and I followed, the cool air hitting me after the long drive. The air smelled heavy with damp soil and old leaves. I remember thinking how dark it was getting, how fast the daylight was disappearing. We started unloading the tent and sleeping bags from the back of the car. My stepfather stumbled a little as he pulled the cooler out, already half drunk. He started yelling about how we were wasting time and that the tent should have been up already. My sister and I tried to help my mom spread out the tent fabric, but the light was almost gone by the time we got the poles in place. We didn't bring a lantern. It was one of those things that everyone thought someone else had packed. We had a few flashlights, but the batteries were weak, and one barely worked. When the last of the daylight vanished, we were left standing in near pitch black, only faint stars showing through the thick canopy above. My stepfather started to get angry, throwing things around and muttering under his breath. He wanted a fire, but my mom told him to just let it go, that it was too dark to collect wood safely. He shouted something I couldn't quite make out and then crawled into the tent. The rest of us followed soon after, not wanting to be outside any longer. Inside the tent, it smelled like nylon and dirt. My mom laid out the sleeping bags in a row. My sister was beside me, and I could feel her shaking. The night outside was silent except for the occasional chirp of crickets. I remember thinking how complete that darkness was, like a weight pressing down. The air inside the tent felt still and stuffy. It must have been close to midnight when I heard it. At first I thought it was just wind moving through the trees. Then it came again, a dry rustle, the sound of dead leaves being crushed underfoot. It wasn't close at first. It was distant, faint, like someone walking slowly somewhere out there in the forest. I froze. My sister shifted beside me, and I could tell she heard it too. I didn't move, barely breathed. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, a deer maybe, but it didn't sound like an animal. The steps were too even, too slow, like a person walking carefully through the woods. The sound would stop for a few seconds and then start again, each time a little closer. The leaves crunching, a branch snapping softly under weight. I wanted to believe it was nothing, but there was a rhythm to it. Step, pause, step, pause. Like whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but couldn't help making noise on the forest floor. I felt my stomach tighten. My mom must have been awake too, because I could hear her breathing change. My stepfather shifted suddenly, maybe realizing something wasn't right. The sound kept getting closer, moving slowly toward us from the darkness. At that moment, I remember feeling the most scared I had ever been in my life. There were no lights, no fire, no one else for miles. Whoever or whatever was out there had no reason to be walking around in the middle of the night in the middle of nowhere. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the dry leaves crunching like they were just outside the tent now. I stared at the thin wall of fabric separating us from whatever was on the other side. My skin prickled, my heart pounding so loud I thought it might give us away. Then there was a sudden crack, a twig snapping sharp and close, too close. It sounded like it came from just a few feet away. I could feel my whole body go cold. I remember my stepfather suddenly bolting upright, the tent shaking as he moved. Then there was chaos. Everyone moved at once. My mom yanked the zipper open and cold air rushed in. I followed my sister out, stumbling over the uneven ground. The forest was pitch black, but we could see the faint outline of the car where the road cut through the trees. We ran. I could barely see where I was going, tripping over roots and branches, hearing the pounding of my heart in my ears. Behind me, I heard the sound of leaves again, faster now, as if whatever had been walking was moving too. I didn't look back. We reached the car, and my stepfather fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking. The car doors slammed, the engine roared to life, and the tires spun in the dirt as we lurched forward. The headlights cut through the dark for only a moment before we were speeding down the narrow forest road, branches scraping against the sides of the car. I remember turning in my seat and seeing nothing behind us, just a black wall of trees swallowing the beam of light as we drove away. No one said anything. The only sound was the engine and my mother's shaky breathing. We never went back for our things. The tent, the sleeping bags, the cooler, all of it was left behind. My stepfather never mentioned the trip again. My mom didn't either. We just pretended it didn't happen. But I still remember every sound, every smell, every second of that night. Even now, more than 30 years later, I still dream about it sometimes. I'll be lying there, half asleep, and I'll start to hear that same faint rustle of leaves, that slow, careful crunch getting closer and closer. I'll wake up with my heart pounding, waiting for that snap of a twig that never comes. I've gone camping a few times since I became an adult, but never deep in the woods, never without other people nearby, and never after dark. I can't stand the sound of dry leaves at night. Even when I'm walking on a trail in daylight, if I hear that crunch behind me, my stomach tightens just like it did back then. I've tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but something in me has never believed that. Whoever, or whatever, was walking through that forest that night had purpose. It moved like it knew exactly where it was going. It moved like it had been watching us from the trees long before we ever heard it. And maybe it would have kept walking right past us if that twig hadn't snapped. But it did, and we left, and I've never been able to forget that sound. I started as a seasonal ranger in the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness in northern Idaho back in the summer of 2017. I was 24, fresh out of college with a degree in environmental science, and I had spent most of my life in suburban Seattle. The thought of working in such a remote and wild place, with nothing but miles of forests, rivers, and mountains, felt like a dream. At first, the job was everything I expected: long days hiking trails, checking permits, and ensuring campers followed the rules. But then, one particular week changed my perspective completely. I was assigned to the East Fork District, which was one of the more isolated sections of the park. There were a handful of logging roads that wound through dense pine forests, and the few cabins scattered throughout were spaced so far apart that you could spend an entire day without seeing another person. My patrols were mostly solo, except when I had to check in with the small ranger station at the base of the main road. One Friday in early July, I started my shift just before sunrise. The air was cold and damp from a light drizzle the night before. I had a route planned that would take me along Deadman Creek, an area known for steep cliffs and thick undergrowth. My goal was to check several backcountry campsites, making sure there were no illegal fires or other hazards. I drove my old 404 along the gravel roads, the tires crunching over loose stones, feeling the usual mix of excitement and solitude that came with being out there. By late morning, I had reached a small clearing near the creek where a few families had camped a week earlier. The area was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as though the forest had swallowed all sound. I noticed signs of recent animal activity, fresh tracks of deer and a large bear, probably a black bear judging by the size, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. I spent a few minutes marking the area in my notebook and then moved on, heading further into the backcountry. Around midday, I decided to follow a narrow logging road that branched off the main path. It was overgrown and rarely used, leading deeper into a canyon where the creek narrowed and the cliffs rose sharply on both sides. The road was rough, and I had to drive slowly, carefully maneuvering around fallen logs and large rocks. After about an hour, I came across a small pullout overlooking the creek. It was a beautiful spot, isolated, with moss-covered rocks and a waterfall tumbling a short distance downstream. I parked, got out to stretch, and took in the silence. There was a faint smell of damp earth and pine, and I could hear the water splashing against the rocks below. As I was about to climb back into my truck, I noticed something unusual. Off to the side of the pullout, partially hidden by a stand of fir trees, there were tire tracks leading into a narrow, overgrown path. They looked fresh, definitely within the last day or two. My first thought was illegal camping, maybe someone trying to sneak into the backcountry without a permit. I decided to investigate. I grabbed my ranger pack, which had first aid supplies, a flashlight, bear spray, and my radio, and carefully walked toward the path. The forest grew denser as I followed the tracks. The sunlight barely filtered through the thick canopy, and the air was damp and heavy. The tracks led to a small flat area near the base of a steep cliff, where I found evidence that someone had been camping recently. Discarded cans, a tattered sleeping bag, and a fire pit with cold ashes. Nothing seemed immediately dangerous, but as I surveyed the area, I noticed a strange smell, something metallic and sharp. I looked closer and realized it was blood, not a little, but a significant amount, smeared on the rocks and soil. My stomach sank. I radioed the ranger station, describing the location and what I'd found. They instructed me to stay put while they sent a team. As I waited, I kept my eyes on the surrounding forest, scanning for any movement. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The wind rustled through the trees, and every snap of a twig made my heart jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Eventually, a team of 2 more experienced rangers arrived. We combed the area and followed the trail further into the canyon. About half a mile in, we found the source of the blood, a hiker who had fallen from the cliff above. He was conscious but badly injured, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He had been climbing alone, likely trying to reach a viewpoint, and slipped on wet rocks. There was no foul play, no one hiding in the woods, just the harsh reality of how dangerous this remote wilderness could be. We stabilized him as best we could and radioed for a helicopter evacuation. The wait was tense. The forest was quiet except for the rushing creek and distant bird calls. I remember thinking about how easy it would have been to miss him, how his injuries could have been fatal if I hadn't followed those tracks. The helicopter finally arrived and we lifted him out of the canyon. Once he was safe, I stayed behind with the rangers to document everything and clear the area. That day stayed with me. It wasn't supernatural or unexplainable. It was the raw danger of being in the wilderness alone. The isolation, the steep cliffs, the thick forests, they didn't forgive mistakes. I realized that being a ranger wasn't just about enforcing rules or patrolling trails. It was about being vigilant, prepared, and ready to face the unpredictable reality of the wild. By the time I drove back to the station that evening, exhausted and tense, the sky was streaked with pink and orange. The mountains looked peaceful from a distance, but I knew the danger lurking in their shadows. That day had reminded me that even a beautiful wilderness could be unforgiving, and it demanded respect. I was 26 when I got my first real solo assignment as a park ranger. It was 2017, late September, and I had been assigned to a remote district in the northern Cascades, Washington. The nearest town, a tiny logging community, was over 2 hours away by the slowest, twistiest back roads. The district itself was mostly old-growth forest, steep hills, and a scattering of lakes carved out by glaciers. My job was recreation and patrol, making sure people didn't wander off the trails, checking for illegal camping, and monitoring wildlife. My first week there had been quiet. Too quiet, I thought at the time. The forest was dense, and the roads leading to the more remote lakes were mostly logging roads that had barely been maintained. The cabin I stayed in was small, run on solar power and a generator, but the solar array was broken, so I had to ration the generator fuel carefully. Nights were long, and the forest was darker than anything I had been used to. There was no hum of distant traffic, no faint city lights, just complete darkness, broken only by moonlight filtering through the massive pines. One evening, I was doing my regular patrol, driving the old truck along a dirt logging road that twisted along the side of a ridge. The sun had already set, but there was still enough twilight to see. I was checking the trailheads near a small lake, popular with anglers in the summer. As I rounded a sharp bend, I noticed something strange on the road ahead. Tracks. Big tracks about the size of a human footprint, but the toes were too long, too wide. At first I thought maybe it was some weird boot print, someone hiking or camping illegally, but the pattern didn't match any footwear I'd ever seen. They were fresh, sunk slightly into the damp roadbed. I snapped a photo with my phone for later, my pulse quickening. I decided to follow them, curiosity winning over caution. The tracks led off the road and into the trees. I parked the truck, grabbed my flashlight, and started walking along the edge of the forest. The canopy was thick, blocking most of the moonlight, and the beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness in a narrow cone. The tracks moved downhill, zigzagging between trees, crossing a small creek, disappearing and reappearing like they belonged to some careful predator. I remember thinking that whatever made these prints was big, much bigger than a person, and walked on two legs. It didn't make sense. Bears were common, but they didn't leave prints like this. I felt that tight knot in my stomach tighten further as the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of crickets and small birds had stopped. Even the wind seemed muted. I kept going, my boots crunching on dead leaves, until I reached a small clearing. The moonlight spilled over a patch of grass, and that's when I saw it. A tarp, partially covered in branches and dirt. My stomach sank. Whoever had been following this area had clearly been hiding something. I shined my flashlight around and noticed more disturbances. Flattened grass, footprints leading around the clearing in a circle. Whoever had been here had been watching something or someone. Then I saw a trail leading further into the forest, and that's when I heard it. A faint rustling, not too close, but definitely moving toward me. My heart started pounding. I thought about yelling, about turning back, but I didn't. I couldn't see anything, just the black shapes of trees moving slightly in the wind. Or maybe it was something else moving. I gripped my flashlight like a weapon and moved slowly toward the sound. The rustling stopped abruptly. Absolute silence returned, and I realized I was deep in the forest, far from the road, my truck and my safety maybe a mile behind me. I stopped, listening, and that's when I noticed the smell, metallic like blood, sharp in the air. My stomach turned. Whoever or whatever had been here recently had injured something. There were fresh, shallow claw marks on a nearby tree. I took out my radio and tried to call the station. Static. No signal. Not surprising given how far I'd gone. I knew I had two options. Keep moving forward and risk running into whatever was out there, or backtrack in the dark along a path I didn't know well. I chose backtracking, trying to follow the faint marks left by the tire tracks of my truck, praying the forest didn't shift too much in the dark. I walked slowly, scanning constantly. About 20 minutes later, I stumbled onto the dirt road, my flashlight beam landing on my truck. Relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I got inside, locked the doors, and sat there for a few minutes, shaking. I thought I was safe, but the forest still loomed beyond the windshield, silent, almost waiting. I drove back to the cabin as fast as I dared, my headlights cutting through the darkness. That night I slept with the cabin door locked, a loaded rifle on my lap. In the morning I went back to the clearing with daylight. The tarp was gone. The prints had disappeared. Nothing made sense. Whatever it was had melted into the forest overnight. After that week, I reported the incident, marked the area as potentially dangerous, and made sure other rangers avoided it. Nothing like it had been seen in the area before. To this day, I don't know what exactly made those prints, or who, or what, had been hiding in that clearing. But the forest had a lesson for me. Curiosity is dangerous, and the woods remember everything. They are vast, and sometimes they are alive in ways you can't understand. I stayed in the Cascades another year, but I never went near that clearing again. The memory still makes my stomach turn, and every time I hear the wind in the pines, I can't help but think about those tracks and the rustling that came out of nowhere, in complete silence. It was real, terrifying, and utterly unexplainable, and that's what made it stick with me forever. I was 25 when I started my first full season as a park ranger in the northern Idaho wilderness. The ranger station was tucked away in a small valley, about 90 minutes from the nearest town. The forest around it was dense, a mix of old pines and cedars, with patches of moss so thick that the ground felt like walking on spongy carpet. It was early spring 2014, and snow was still melting in the shaded areas, leaving streams swollen and muddy. My job was mostly routine: trail maintenance, patrolling backcountry areas, checking on campers, and monitoring wildlife activity. But nothing could have prepared me for what I experienced that year. I was assigned a stretch of forest that included several old logging roads that hadn't been used in decades. Some of them were so overgrown that I had to push through branches and fallen trees just to make progress. One afternoon, I set out on a solo patrol, driving my old Jeep slowly along a dirt road that twisted between steep hills. The sun was low, orange and soft, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I had a clipboard with maps, a radio in my chest pocket, a fully charged flashlight, and my standard ranger kit in the back. I was checking an area where campers had reported missing equipment the previous year. There were no active campgrounds here, just deep hidden clearings where people like to disappear into the woods. The trees were thick enough to block cell reception entirely, and I knew I wouldn't have radio contact for more than a few miles at a time. I had done this route dozens of times, but that day felt different. The forest seemed quieter than usual, almost unnaturally so. No birds, no wind through the needles, just a still, heavy silence that pressed against my ears. Around 3 p.m, I came to a fork in the road. One path led downhill to a pond I had patrolled many times. The other curved sharply to the east, where the terrain got rockier and steeper. I decided to take the eastern path, thinking I'd check a small clearing where campers sometimes left behind trash or fire pits. I parked the Jeep near a large fallen cedar and stepped out, snapping on my gloves. The air smelled damp, earthy, and cold against my skin. I moved slowly, scanning the forest floor for any signs of recent activity. I didn't find much at first. Just a few broken branches, some old tire tracks, and a couple of scattered cans that had been there for years. But then I noticed something strange. There were faint footprints leading away from the clearing. They were boot prints, but the tread didn't match anything in my database of registered visitors. They were fresh, maybe a day old, and they led uphill into the thickest part of the forest. I frowned. This was unusual. The area wasn't heavily trafficked, and the prints suggested someone had been moving stealthily. I decided to follow them cautiously, keeping my flashlight and radio close. The footprints led to a steep ridge, overgrown with ferns and fallen branches. I had to pull myself up, grabbing roots and rocks to keep from slipping. As I climbed, I noticed more oddities. Small items were scattered along the path. Twigs snapped unnaturally, rocks arranged as if someone had shifted them deliberately, almost like markers. My gut tightened. I had worked in these woods long enough to know when something didn't belong. About half an hour later, I reached a small plateau, partially hidden by a tangle of trees. I froze. There was a tent set up here, bright green, modern, with no identification tags or signs of ownership nearby. A campfire was smoldering, and the smell of smoke hung in the air. I scanned the area carefully, and that's when I noticed movement. A figure crouched near the tent, rifling through a backpack. They froze as soon as they saw me, but before I could react, they bolted deeper into the trees. I didn't chase. The terrain was too dangerous, and I knew I could easily injure myself if I tried. Instead, I took careful note of the tracks leading away. I returned to my Jeep slowly, keeping my eyes on the forest around me. My heart was pounding, and I kept hearing the occasional crack of a branch that made me spin around. By the time I got back to the ranger station, it was dark. I filed a report, noting the footprints, the abandoned camp, and the likely presence of an unknown trespasser. Over the next few days, I patrolled the area repeatedly. I found signs that the person had returned, more footprints, small caches of supplies hidden under brush, but I never saw them again. I increased my presence, marking trails, setting up motion-triggered cameras, and checking nearby clearings multiple times a day. It took weeks before the forest felt normal again, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was always watching from the shadows. By summer, the snow had melted completely, and the forest had returned to its usual rhythm. Birds sang, streams ran clear, and hikers started to appear on the main trails again. I never found the person who had been sneaking through the backcountry that spring. But the experience taught me a lesson I've never forgotten. The wilderness can be quiet and beautiful, but it's never completely safe, and not all dangers come from nature. Some are human, hidden in the brush, patient, and willing to stay just out of reach. That year ended without further incident, and the area remained under my watch. I installed additional signage and cameras, and I checked in with other rangers to ensure they knew the routes. Eventually, the footprints stopped appearing. I never discovered who had set up the tent or why they were hiding, but the sense of relief that came with returning to normal patrols was profound. I realized that being a ranger wasn't just about maintaining trails or monitoring wildlife. It was about vigilance, patience, and knowing that even the smallest clues can tell you when something is wrong. I still think about that spring sometimes, especially when I'm walking a quiet trail alone. The forest is beautiful, yes, but I know it has secrets, and some of them are human. And that knowledge keeps me alert, keeps me careful, and keeps me alive. I was 24 years old when I started my first solo season as a park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. It was 2012, and I had just finished my ranger training, feeling proud but untested. My district was huge, over 50,000 acres of dense coniferous forest, jagged ridges, and old logging roads that twisted through valleys and over mountains. The ranger station where I stayed was small, a wooden cabin with a single solar panel array that struggled to keep the lights on during overcast days. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was almost 2 hours away, which only made me feel more isolated, but also like I was doing exactly the work I had dreamed of. The first couple of weeks were uneventful. I would patrol back roads, check on trailheads, keep an eye out for illegal campers or hunters, and occasionally rescue hikers who got lost. Most nights, I would fall asleep to the sounds of the forest, wind shaking the pines, distant elk bugling, and sometimes the low hum of an unseen animal moving through the underbrush. I thought I was prepared for solitude. I wasn't. It was mid-September when the incident happened. The air was crisp, and the leaves on the larch were turning gold. I was finishing a long patrol along an old logging road that followed the edge of a canyon. The road was narrow and eroded in parts, with thick brush pressing in on either side. My truck's headlights barely cut through the growing shadows. I was on my way back to the cabin when I noticed something unusual. A pile of discarded camping gear at a turnoff, partially hidden by brush. Tents, backpacks, and a cooler, all abandoned. I slowed down, checking for footprints or tire tracks. The ground was dry, so any disturbance should have been visible. I noticed something else. A series of deep scratches on the bark of a nearby tree. They were fresh, jagged, almost desperate, as if whatever had done it had been trying to climb or hold on to the trunk. My pulse quickened, but I reminded myself that the forest had bears, cougars, and other wildlife. I radioed the station to report abandoned gear and potential animal activity, but the radio crackled with nothing but static. It wasn't unusual, but it made me uneasy. I decided to investigate on foot. I left my truck a safe distance away and moved slowly, scanning the underbrush. The closer I got, the more I realized something wasn't right. The campsite looked like it had been left in a hurry. Boots left in the dirt, a half-empty water bottle, a backpack zipped open with clothes spilling out. And then I saw it, faint tracks leading away from the clearing. They were human footprints, barefoot, small, heading deeper into the woods. I frowned. No one goes barefoot in these parts, especially not in September. Against my better judgment, I followed them. The forest seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder, even though the sun was still above the ridges. Birds had gone silent. Every crackle of a branch underfoot sounded amplified. The tracks led me down a steep slope over a narrow creek and into a thick patch of firs. The further I went, the harder it was to see the tracks. Then I heard something. Soft, deliberate footsteps that weren't mine. My heart pounded. I froze, straining to hear. The steps stopped. I decided it was time to turn back. As I retraced my path, I realized I was being followed. Every time I stopped, I could hear it. The brush moving, the occasional snap of a twig, close enough that I could swear someone was right behind me. I didn't dare run. I knew the terrain too well, and one wrong move could send me tumbling down the slope. Instead, I moved slowly, deliberately, keeping my eyes on the ground and listening. By the time I reached the logging road, the sun was dipping below the ridges, My truck was exactly where I left it, but I wasn't safe yet. The forest seemed alive around me, every shadow holding a threat. I climbed into the cab, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but as I drove, I thought I saw movement in the trees. Brief flashes of something human, ducking behind trunks, keeping pace with me. I kept my speed steady, heart hammering, and made it back to the cabin without incident. That night, I double-checked the locks on the cabin and went over the situation in my mind. No gear was missing from the station, no signs of forced entry. Whoever, or whatever, had left that campsite had vanished into the forest without a trace. I slept with one eye open, listening to the wind and shadows. The next day, I returned to the site during daylight. There was nothing. The footprints had disappeared completely. The discarded gear was gone. It was as if no one had ever been there. I searched the surrounding area for hours, taking notes and photographs, but there was nothing unusual, no signs of struggle, no broken branches beyond normal forest growth. The park reported no missing hikers in the region. Weeks later, I pieced together what likely happened. Someone had set up a temporary campsite and left in a hurry. Maybe an illegal hunter, or someone trying to hide in the forest. The barefoot prints suggested a person trying to move quietly or evade detection. The scratches on the tree could have been from climbing or perhaps a bear encounter. Whatever it was gone, and I was lucky to have made it back safely. That experience changed the way I patrolled. I started paying attention to tiny details, disturbed soil, broken branches, unusual tracks. I learned to respect the forest not just for its wildlife, but for its ability to hide people with bad intentions. The memory of those barefoot tracks, following me through the shadows, stayed with me for years, a reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it just waits quietly in the trees. By the end of that season, I had grown more cautious, more aware, but also more confident in my skills. I knew that while the forest could be unpredictable, staying alert, keeping calm, and thinking logically was what kept rangers alive. I never saw those people, or whatever they were, again. But I carried that lesson with me every day I walked the trails, drove the roads, and patrolled the backcountry. It was a season I would never forget, and it taught me that fear in the forest is real, but it is also manageable if you respect it. I had been working as a seasonal park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana since early June of 2018. I was 24 at the time, fresh out of ranger training, and this was my first real solo assignment. The district I was assigned to covered a large stretch of backcountry, mostly rugged wilderness with old logging roads, thick conifer forests, and small isolated lakes. The nearest town, Sula, was nearly an hour and a half away by dirt roads, and cell service was spotty at best. My station was a small wooden guard shack that had been built in the 1970s, with peeling paint, a solar panel that rarely worked, and a single generator I was told could handle basic needs if I kept it maintained. I got used to being alone quickly. The first few nights were unsettling, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears. There were sounds I had never noticed before, the snap of twigs, the low groan of wind through the pines, the distant splash of water hitting rocks in a creek. I carried a .30-06 rifle during patrols, more out of habit than necessity. I didn't expect trouble, but experience in ranger training had taught me not to underestimate the wilderness. It was late August when the incident happened. The summer had been unusually dry and the risk of wildfires was high. I had been patrolling a series of back roads I hadn't been on before, taking note of illegally dumped trash, checking remote campsites, and monitoring wildlife. The day had started sunny but was shifting to gray clouds by late afternoon. I was near a small pond tucked between two ridges, surrounded by dense fir and cedar. The road had narrowed to barely more than a rutted path, overgrown with brush and fallen branches. I parked my truck at a small clearing and grabbed my binoculars and field notebook. The first thing I noticed, as I scanned the tree line across the pond, was how still everything was. No birds calling, no movement in the bushes. That kind of silence never bodes well in the backcountry. I chalked it up to the late afternoon lull, but I still felt a prickle at the back of my neck. I set off along a narrow game trail that led into a thicker part of the forest, intending to circle around the pond. The ground was soft with moss and fallen needles muffling my footsteps. As I walked, I noticed something odd, a series of footprints that didn't match any wildlife I was familiar with. They were too large to be a deer or a bear, and they seemed human-sized. At first, I assumed some hiker or camper had passed through, but the prints were deep, heavy, and spaced oddly, as if whoever or whatever was walking was dragging something. My heart started to beat a little faster. I continued along the trail, rifle slung, and tried to rationalize. People sometimes hike alone out here, and I had seen my fair share of odd behavior. But then I noticed a subtle pattern. The prints weren't just along the trail. They were also in the shallow water of the pond. Someone had been wading through it, moving slowly, deliberately. I decided it was best to head back to my truck. The clouds were thickening, and the light was dimming faster than usual. On the way back, I saw more signs: broken branches, trampled ferns, and scuff marks along the trunks of the trees. Whoever had been here was moving toward the pond from the forest, and now it seemed like they were following the same path I had just come from. By the time I reached the clearing where my truck was parked, the air had a damp, heavy smell. The pond reflected the gray sky like a mirror. I climbed into the truck, locked the doors, and started the engine. My eyes kept flicking to the tree line, and I thought I saw movement. Figures just beyond the tree shadows. I decided to call it in. My radio crackled, and after a few attempts, I got Sula Dispatch on the line. I reported the footprints, the broken branches, and the general sense of someone being in the area. Dispatch told me to stay put and keep an eye on things until backup arrived. Hours passed. The wind picked up, rustling the branches. The figures I thought I saw earlier were gone, or maybe they had been my imagination. I scanned the pond again and noticed something I had missed before. A small makeshift shelter on the far side, barely visible through the brush. A tarp strung between two trees, some empty cans, and what looked like a fire pit with ashes still warm. Someone had been living here. Backup arrived just before sunset. A second ranger, older and more experienced, drove up in a four-wheel drive. We inspected the area together, noting the footprints in the shelter. It was clearly a transient squatter, probably hiding from the authorities. No one had been threatening me directly, but the isolation, the deliberate tracks, and the knowledge that someone had been moving around in the dark without me knowing exactly where kept the tension high. We left the pond and drove back toward the main road. I felt relieved to have another person with me, but the adrenaline lingered. I spent the rest of the season more cautious, always scanning the tree line, always paying attention to footprints and other signs of human activity. Looking back, that day taught me a valuable lesson. The wilderness is unpredictable not just because of animals or weather, but because of other humans. People can be as dangerous as the forest itself, and isolation magnifies that danger. I never felt anything supernatural, just the very real, very human sense of being watched, followed, and unknown. The ending was simple. Awareness and caution kept me safe. I left that patrol with a deeper respect for the forest and the hidden lives moving through it, and a recognition that sometimes the scariest things in the woods are the ones you don't see until it's almost too late. I had just finished my first week as a full-time park ranger in the remote northern district of the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. It was the spring of 2014, and I was 24, fresh out of the seasonal ranger program. The area I was assigned to was vast and sparsely traveled, with only a handful of dirt roads winding through the dense pine and fir forests. The nearest town was over 2 hours away, and cell service was spotty at best, something they didn't really warn me about during training. My first few nights were quiet. I had the old guard station all to myself. It was a small, weathered cabin perched on a ridge overlooking a creek, and I spent the evenings going through maps and checking gear. I had a small solar panel set up, but spring storms had knocked it out, leaving me with limited power. That first week I was already adjusting to the isolation and the constant, almost oppressive quiet of the forest. Birds, wind through the trees, and the occasional snap of a branch underfoot were the only sounds. It was on the sixth night that I began noticing something odd. I had stayed late checking a logging trail on the western side of my district, a path that wound down into a valley thick with old-growth trees. By the time I turned my truck around and started heading back up the hill toward the station, the sky was dark, heavy clouds blocking what little moonlight there was. I remember glancing at my watch. It was just past 11. As I drove slowly up the dirt road, I noticed fresh tire tracks cutting across the main trail. They weren't from a ranger vehicle. These were wider, deeper, like someone had been driving a heavy truck or an SUV off-road. That alone wasn't unusual. People trespassed in the forest all the time, but something about the tracks made my stomach tighten. They were fresh, heading in the same direction I was going, and they seemed deliberate. I shrugged it off. Maybe a hunter, I told myself. The forest had legal hunting areas, and it was spring turkey season. I kept driving, eyes scanning the edge of the woods, fingers gripping the steering wheel. The road narrowed as I climbed, the trees pressing close on both sides. Then I noticed it. A shadow, or maybe a figure, darting between the trunks about 50 feet away from the road. My first thought was deer, or maybe a stray elk, but the movement was too purposeful, too human. I slowed my truck to a crawl, the headlights barely piercing the darkness. The figure stopped, just standing there, barely visible. I could feel my pulse thudding in my ears. I flipped on the roof lights, hoping to get a better look. Nothing. Just trees and darkness. I told myself I was imagining things, that my brain was making patterns in the shadows. When I got back to the station, I locked the doors, double-checked my rifle, and sat by the small wood stove, trying to convince myself it was nothing. I had barely slept that night, tossing and turning, listening to every sound outside. The forest had a rhythm, wind in the trees, the creek down the ridge. But that night there were new sounds. Footsteps, or branches breaking under some weight I couldn't see. My imagination, I thought, had to be. The next morning I went to inspect the area near the tracks. I hiked down the slope where the road cut into the valley. The tracks were there, unmistakable, and they didn't belong to any vehicle I recognized. What caught my attention was the evidence of someone, or multiple someones, moving through the forest. Broken branches at about chest height, flattened underbrush in a path that led toward a hidden part of the creek, and faint footprints. The prints were muddy and irregular, like someone had been trying not to leave a trace or was in a hurry. Over the next few days I kept a close watch. Every night I heard movement outside, sometimes around the perimeter of the station. The wind would blow, and shadows would stretch unnaturally. I set up trail cameras along the road and near the creek. What I caught made my stomach turn. Images of someone watching the station at night, crouched behind trees or standing just at the edge of the frame, hood pulled over their head. They never came closer than 30 feet, but they were always there. It went on for nearly a week. I didn't see them during the day, but the nighttime patrols became a constant. I logged everything, made notes, and even considered calling the county sheriff, but I was worried about false alarms. I was alone, responsible for miles of forest, and needed to stay rational. Finally, it ended the way it always had to in these situations. I caught them in the act. One night, I was out checking the generator, which had sputtered back to life after a repair, and I noticed a glint of metal among the shadows near the edge of the creek. I raised my rifle, and there he was, a man in his late 20s, covered in mud, trying to pry open a storage shed. I yelled, and he bolted into the trees. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The next morning, when I inspected the tracks, it was clear he had left the forest entirely. His prints ended at the edge of the district, leading down to the logging road that connected to the main highway. The sheriff confirmed later that he was a known poacher, wanted for multiple cases across 3 counties. He had a habit of scouting isolated areas, targeting game and cabins, always disappearing before law enforcement could get there. I had unwittingly stumbled into his pattern, but staying calm, observing carefully, and documenting everything had kept me and the forest safe. By the end of the month, the patrols stopped. I never saw him again, but I never forgot the feeling of eyes watching in the dark, the weight of the forest pressing close, and the quiet dread of knowing someone had been moving through my district without me realizing it at first. It taught me vigilance, patience, and the importance of trusting my instincts in the backcountry. The forest didn't forgive mistakes, and neither did the people who trespassed in it. Even now, whenever I patrol remote areas, I remember that first encounter. I know the forest holds secrets, but it also teaches respect, and in the end, it's about keeping a balance, protecting the land and its visitors, even when fear tries to take over. I was 24 years old when I got my first real assignment as a park ranger in the northern stretches of Montana. I had just finished the training program in Bozeman, and they sent me out to a small remote district near the Bob Marshall Wilderness. My guard station was a tiny, weathered cabin tucked along the edge of a narrow dirt road, surrounded on all sides by dense pines and spruce. The nearest town was nearly 2 hours away, over winding mountain roads that could easily be closed by snow or mudslides. It was the summer of 2014, and I was supposed to be handling general maintenance, trail inspections, and occasional wildlife monitoring. Most of the other rangers would check in once or twice a week, but for the most part, I was completely alone. I brought in enough supplies for a month at a time, and the only human contact I had was over radio, or the rare passing hiker. The first week went smoothly. I checked the trails, patched up old signs, and kept an eye on some wildlife camera traps I had set up near a creek. The nights were quiet, except for the usual animal sounds, owls, foxes, and the occasional elk bugle echoing through the canyon. I slept poorly, mostly because I wasn't used to the isolation, and the cabin had its own quirks. Creaking floorboards, drafts that whistled through the cracks in the walls, and a rusty old heater that sometimes kicked on at odd hours. On the second week, I noticed something odd on the trails near the North Ridge. There were tracks I didn't recognize, human-like but strangely spaced, almost like someone was taking very long, careful steps. At first, I thought maybe it was some hikers who had wandered off trail, but the area was mostly inaccessible, with thick underbrush and steep cliffs. There were no signs of camping gear or other human activity, just footprints that seemed to appear out of nowhere and disappear just as abruptly. I didn't think much of it initially. I chalked it up to local hunters or hikers straying off the trails, which was common in that area. But by the third week, the feeling of being watched started creeping in. I would be out checking a camera trap, and the hairs on the back of my neck would stand up. Sometimes I would hear a branch snap behind me, but when I turned around, nothing was there. One night, I woke to the sound of the cabin door rattling, as if someone had tried to open it. I jumped up, grabbed my flashlight, and ran to the door, but it was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. I told myself it was just animals, maybe a deer or a bear testing the door. I tried to keep busy during the day to avoid thinking about it. I went on longer patrols, hiked to remote spots, and checked all the usual maintenance points. One afternoon, while hiking along a ridge overlooking a narrow valley, I found something that made my stomach turn. There were dozens of old footprints, some fresh, some worn from weeks of weather, all leading toward a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing, someone had built a rough wooden structure, no more than a crude frame, about 6 feet high, leaning slightly to one side. It looked like it had been used for shelter, maybe for a hunter or someone hiding out, but there was no fire pit, no discarded food, just the frame and a scattering of broken branches around it. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining someone moving just outside the cabin watching me. Around midnight I heard it, a faint rustling, slow and deliberate, like someone stepping carefully through the underbrush. My instincts screamed at me to grab my radio and call for backup, but I didn't want to overreact. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly stepped outside. The beam swept across the clearing in front of the cabin. The trees swayed, the wind whispered, and then I saw them, footprints in the mud, fresh, leading straight toward my cabin. I ran inside, locked every door, and sat on the floor, flashlight in hand. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. At first light, I grabbed my truck keys and drove down the dirt road to the ranger station about an hour away. I reported the structure, the tracks, and the noises. They told me it could be someone squatting in the forest, but they promised to send another ranger to check it out. By the time I returned 2 days later, the frame was gone. The footprints, completely erased by rain, left no trace. The forest had swallowed everything. My relief was overwhelming, but also unsettling. Whoever, or whatever, had been out there was gone, but it had been close enough to watch, close enough to intimidate. I made sure my cabin was reinforced, set up extra motion sensors, and never spent another night alone in that area without someone nearby. By the end of the summer, I had learned a harsh truth. The forest was bigger and more isolated than I had imagined, and sometimes the scariest things weren't supernatural, they were human. A person could hide in those woods for days, weeks, even months, unseen, moving silently while you thought you were safe. That knowledge stayed with me long after the summer ended. I never saw anyone, never found evidence beyond those tracks. But I never forgot the way it felt to know I wasn't alone, to hear someone, or something, moving in the trees while I was trapped in my own cabin. It was a long summer, and I finished my assignment with more respect for isolation than fear. I learned how to secure my surroundings, how to trust my instincts, and how to keep calm when the unknown seemed right outside my door. That experience, terrifying as it was, made me a better ranger. I never stopped patrolling remote areas, but I never underestimated how quiet, empty forests can hide more than just wildlife. I was 27 when I took the seasonal ranger position at Lost Pine National Forest in northern Oregon. It was the spring of 2018, and I had just finished my first semester at the state forestry program. I had spent most of my life in cities, but the solitude of the forest had always called to me. So when this opportunity came along, I jumped at it. The district I was assigned to was small, just over 20,000 acres, but rugged. The nearest town, Mill Creek, was about 2 hours away by dirt road, which meant that if something went wrong, help would not arrive quickly. I liked that isolation at first. It made me feel alive. The first few weeks were routine. I drove the old Ford Ranger along logging roads, checking trailheads, inspecting campsites, and making sure hikers and campers were following the rules. I carried a rifle, a first aid kit, and a radio, though reception was spotty. The forest was dense, mostly Douglas fir and western hemlock, with thick undergrowth that made it almost impossible to see more than 50 feet ahead in some areas. I liked those tight corridors. They made the forest feel alive, but in a quiet, safe way. One day in early May, I was doing a solo patrol near a remote section called Granite Hollow. The trail narrowed into an overgrown logging road, and the trees pressed in on either side, their branches brushing against my truck. The sky was gray, and the rain had started in light, persistent drizzles that made the dirt road slick. I had just passed a small creek when I saw a figure on the road ahead. At first I thought it was another hiker, but as I got closer, I realized something was off. The person was crouched on the ground, wearing a muddy jacket, and seemed to be moving awkwardly. My first instinct was concern. I slowed the truck and called out, but there was no response. I got out and approached carefully, the wet leaves slippery underfoot. When I was a few feet away, I could see that it wasn't someone hurt or lost. The figure was scavenging. There were piles of old camping gear and food wrappers spread out in a small circle, and the person was picking through them like an animal. I backed off and called for backup over the radio, though I knew it would take at least an hour for anyone to arrive. The figure didn't notice me at first, and then suddenly it bolted into the trees. I ran after it, slipping in the mud, but it was gone before I could even catch a glimpse of where it went. That part of the forest was thick with brush and fallen logs. Even someone who knew the area well could hide easily. I spent the next hour patrolling the perimeter, looking for signs. But all I found were footprints, human, bare feet, moving in erratic directions, and a few torn scraps of clothing caught on branches. The whole situation set my nerves on edge. I had been alone in forests before, but never had someone so close, unseen and unpredictable. When I got back to my truck, I double-checked my rifle, loaded extra rounds, and drove slowly back toward the ranger station, constantly scanning the tree line. The next few days were uneventful, but I kept seeing signs that someone had been in the area. Footprints in mud near campsites, half-eaten food, discarded clothing, even small fires that had been lit and abandoned. It was obvious this person was living rough in the forest, maybe squatting illegally, but I couldn't figure out their intentions. I tried to report it, but Mill Creek Sheriff's Department warned me that they couldn't send anyone out until the person was clearly threatening others. Then one evening, about a week later, I was on a late patrol. The sun had already gone down, leaving only the dim glow of the fading twilight. I was following a narrow logging trail, heading back to my small guard station when I noticed something unusual. A large tree branch had been snapped off at chest height, angled across the road. My heart skipped. That wasn't natural. Someone had deliberately set that as a barrier. I stopped the truck and got out, flashlight in hand. Suddenly I heard movement behind me, soft footsteps on wet leaves. I froze. The figure stepped into the dim light of my beam. It was the same person, covered in mud, eyes wild, clutching a hunting knife that glinted in the flashlight. My stomach sank. I took a step back, keeping my rifle pointed at them, voice steady even though my hands were shaking. The person didn't speak. They just crouched and darted to the side, disappearing into the trees again. I didn't chase. I knew the forest better than anyone, but at night, in that dense area, it was a dangerous gamble. Instead, I called Mill Creek, explained the situation, and requested immediate backup. By the time the deputy arrived, the person was gone. We spent the night setting up motion sensors, lights, and patrols around Granite Hollow. By morning, there was no trace of them, only flattened brush and footprints leading deeper into the forest. Over the next 2 weeks, the presence in Granite Hollow diminished. I never saw the person again, but their signs remained scattered, small, unsettling reminders that someone had survived in those woods without help, without anyone noticing. Eventually, Mill Creek issued a warning to campers and the area saw fewer visitors. I patrolled regularly, but the forest returned to its quiet normalcy. That experience stayed with me for years. It taught me that the forest isn't just beautiful, it's unpredictable. There are people in it who know how to survive in ways most of us can't imagine, and some of them aren't friendly. I left Lost Pine the next year, but every time I drove through dense trees or heard the crunch of leaves behind me, I remembered Granite Hollow and the wild, desperate person who had vanished into the shadows, leaving me to wonder if they were still out there, watching. I had just turned 27 when I started my first solo season as a park ranger at Blackwood National Forest, a remote section of northern Montana. The nearest town was over 2 hours away, a dusty little settlement with one gas station, a post office, and a diner that smelled perpetually of burnt coffee. I had spent the first few weeks getting used to the patrol routes, learning the terrain, and checking in on the seasonal cabins that were scattered throughout the forest for hikers and hunters. It was early September, and the first hints of fall were already brushing the edges of the trees. The air had a crisp bite to it, and the light slanted low through the pines in the late afternoon. I was alone in the ranger station that night. The station itself was a small single-story cabin with solar panels that struggled to keep the place fully powered. The generator had been acting up all week, and I hadn't slept more than a couple of hours at a time. The quiet of the forest pressed in around the cabin, heavy and tangible. There was a creek a few hundred yards downhill, and sometimes I could hear it moving over rocks even in the stillness of the night. Most nights that sound was comforting. That night, it felt like a warning. Around 8 p.m., I did my usual round of checking the park radios, noting weather reports, and scanning the trail cameras that were set along the less traveled routes. The cameras were supposed to detect wildlife, mostly elk and deer, but I often checked them for any signs of trespassers or illegal hunting. The last few frames on one camera had caught something odd, a set of footprints that didn't match any patterns I'd seen before. They were too large for a deer, too deep for a fox, and far too human-like to belong to any other animal in the area. I pulled up the GPS coordinates, which placed the tracks near the old logging trail about 4 miles west of my station. I noted it down but didn't think much of it at first. Hikers sometimes came in from the back roads, and there were always hunters around this time of year. I decided to take a walk before night fully settled in. I grabbed my flashlight, a spare radio, my sidearm, and a small first aid kit. The moon was nearly full, but the forest floor was thick with shadows, and the trees bent low over the trail like dark sentinels. I walked quietly, listening to the snapping of twigs under my boots and the occasional rustle of leaves from small animals. I kept thinking about the footprints. There was no one supposed to be out there at this hour, especially not without notifying the park office. My gut told me something wasn't right. About 2 miles in, I reached the spot where the camera had recorded the tracks. The soil was damp from a recent rainfall, and the prints were clearly visible. They were enormous, easily a foot long, with an odd spread that suggested the person, or whatever it was carrying a lot of weight. The prints weren't alone. There were drag marks beside them, long deep grooves that looked like something heavy had been pulled along the forest floor. I crouched down, shining my flashlight along the ground, trying to make sense of it. Nothing seemed alive, nothing moved. But my heart was pounding, and a cold sweat formed along my neck. I followed the prints slowly, my flashlight slicing through the darkness. They led toward a shallow valley where the forest opened into a clearing near a dry creek bed. That's when I noticed it, the faint smell of something metallic and raw. Blood. My stomach turned and I gripped my flashlight tighter. I had worked search and rescue missions before, but this was different. I was alone. I had no backup for miles, and whatever had left these tracks was still out there. I reached the clearing and saw a makeshift campsite. It was crude, nothing like a normal hiker's setup. A small fire had been recently extinguished, the ashes still warm. Nearby, I found a torn backpack, its contents scattered, a flashlight, a half-empty water bottle, and some canned food. Then I saw the ground. Dark, sticky streaks led further into the trees. They weren't old. They glistened faintly under the beam of my flashlight. Whatever had happened here had been violent, and judging by the trail, it hadn't been more than an hour or two ago. My instincts screamed to call it in and retreat, but something compelled me to keep moving. I followed the blood trail for nearly 30 minutes, careful to keep my bearings and avoid making noise. The forest seemed alive in a way it hadn't before. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves sent my pulse racing. Then I saw it, an overturned ATV hidden in the bushes, its engine still warm. It had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. Around it were more footprints, fresh and large. I radioed the situation in, keeping my voice steady even though my hands shook. I explained the scene, the tracks, the blood. The dispatcher told me backup was on the way, but it would be at least 45 minutes before anyone could get there. While I waited, I documented the area with my camera, careful not to disturb anything. I stayed on the perimeter of the clearing, listening. Nothing moved, yet the forest felt oppressive. The wind picked up, rattling the branches, and the shadows stretched longer. I caught glimpses of movement in the underbrush, but could never be sure if it was an animal or not. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, but leaving meant potentially losing evidence, or worse, walking into danger unprepared. Finally, headlights appeared through the trees. Another ranger drove up in the patrol truck. Together we carefully examined the scene. We tracked the footprints further, but they ended abruptly at a steep bank leading down to the creek. I felt a knot in my chest tighten. Whoever or whatever had made the tracks wasn't around anymore. The blood trail had stopped. There was no sign of anyone hiding nearby. By morning, a full search team combed the area. They found more evidence of a serious injury, but no person. The ATV had been stolen from a nearby campsite a few days prior, and it was clear that someone had tried to cover their tracks in a panic. In the end, the victim, or suspect, was never found, and the incident was classified as a missing person case. I was shaken for weeks, haunted by the feeling that someone, or something human, had been in those woods, desperate and dangerous, and could still be out there. It taught me something vital. The forest doesn't need ghosts to be frightening. It's the very real unknown, the unpredictable nature of people and animals, that can make it terrifying. After that season, I changed my patrol routines, always worked in pairs when possible, and never underestimated the quiet danger lurking in places most people thought were safe. I also carried an extra radio and more backup supplies everywhere I went. Blackwood National Forest was beautiful, but it had a very sharp edge, and I learned, the hard way, that being alone there can be more dangerous than anything I could have imagined. I was 24 when I got my first full-time ranger position at Cedar Ridge National Forest, a stretch of remote wilderness in northern Washington. The nearest town was nearly 2 hours away by car, and the forest itself was a tangle of logging roads, old fire trails, and dense pine groves that seemed to swallow sound. I was fresh out of college, eager, and maybe a little naive about what life would actually be like out there. I had spent my first month learning the trails, doing routine checks, and getting used to the long stretches of silence, which at first I found peaceful. But by late summer, the quiet started to feel heavy, almost oppressive. One August evening, I was finishing up a long patrol in the northern sector of the forest, near a section known as Bear Hollow. It was a ridge between two small streams, thick with fir and alder, and the area had been logged intermittently over the last few decades, leaving a patchwork of open glades and dense growth. I was driving my old Ford Ranger pickup along a narrow logging road that hadn't seen heavy traffic in years. My plan was to check a series of remote trailheads before nightfall and then head back to the ranger station. The sun had dipped low when I noticed something strange. A pair of headlights appeared far ahead on the dirt road, moving slowly and erratically. It wasn't unusual to see someone driving a contractor's truck or a camper, but the way this vehicle swerved and slowed unnaturally made my stomach tighten. I kept my distance, trying not to let the person notice me, but as I got closer, I realized the truck wasn't following the road properly. It seemed to be bouncing over ruts and soft soil, almost as if the driver was unfamiliar with the terrain, or not fully in control. I decided to pull over to the side and watch. The vehicle stopped about 50 yards ahead, right where the road narrowed between two clusters of trees. I could just make out a figure stepping out of the driver's side. At first I thought it might be a lost hiker or a hunter, but the posture was strange, rigid, unnatural. The figure didn't carry a backpack or any gear, nothing at all. Then, slowly, it began walking toward the forest rather than staying near the road. I radioed the station to report a possible lost person, but the signal was weak in that area. The radio cut out after a few garbled words. I left my truck and followed cautiously on foot, keeping the last rays of sunlight behind me. The air was thick and humid, the scent of wet earth and pine heavy in my nose. Every snap of a twig underfoot sounded deafening. I tried calling out, but the words died in my throat, almost as if my own voice felt wrong in that stillness. I saw the figure stop near a shallow creek, staring down at something on the ground. I couldn't tell what it was from that distance. I moved closer, careful to stay downwind and silent, and that's when I noticed the truck. It was parked haphazardly on the bank, door wide open. Inside, I could see a small first aid kit and a pair of muddy boots on the floor. The truck looked abandoned, but the keys were still in the ignition. A shiver ran down my spine. Something about the scene didn't add up. People who wandered in here usually had their gear, their sense of direction, or a plan. This didn't. I stepped forward, and that's when I saw it clearly. The figure was crouched over the creek, rifling through the shallow water with bare hands. At first I thought it might be searching for a rock or some debris, but then I noticed the blood. Small, dark streaks ran along the rocks and into the water. My pulse raced. My training kicked in. I needed to secure the scene and call for backup. I ducked behind a tree and reached for my radio again, but there was still no signal. The figure suddenly stood upright and looked directly at me. I froze. The way it moved, jerky, unnatural, tense, made my stomach drop. I realized it wasn't a lost hiker. Whoever this was had been here for hours, maybe days, and they were dangerous. I backed slowly toward my truck, keeping my eyes fixed on them. By the time I reached it, the figure had vanished into the trees, moving faster than a normal person should be able to. I didn't chase. I knew the forest better, and I knew getting caught in the dark alone with whoever this was could be fatal. I drove straight to the ranger station, lights off, heart pounding. I filed a detailed report and requested additional patrols in the area. That night, sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, sounded like footsteps. I stayed awake until the first hints of dawn, constantly checking the windows. Over the next few weeks, we discovered that this individual had been illegally hunting and poaching in the northern sector, moving through the backcountry with alarming skill. Signs of their activity, traps, discarded animal carcasses, and hidden caches of food were scattered throughout the area. Eventually, a joint effort with local authorities led to their capture, far from the spot I had seen them that evening. They were armed, volatile, and considered extremely dangerous. Looking back, I realized that had I confronted them alone in that clearing, things could have gone much worse. The forest returned to its usual quiet after that, but I never forgot that night. Cedar Ridge seemed a little smaller, a little less safe. I learned to respect the silence, the shadows, and the fact that people could be far more frightening than any storm or bear. The lesson stuck with me. In the wilderness, danger doesn't always announce itself with growls or footprints. It sometimes comes silently, hidden behind human eyes. I started my first solo summer as a park ranger in 2018 at a small district in northeastern Oregon. I was 24, freshly out of the ranger training program, and eager to prove myself. The station was small, just a weathered wooden cabin tucked into a clearing off a winding gravel road. The nearest town, where the gas station and grocery store were, was over an hour and a half away by car. The park itself was dense with old-growth fir and cedar, with moss-draped branches, steep ridges, and narrow streams that cut deep into the valley floors. I had been warned that this part of the forest had a reputation for being quiet in ways that made your skin crawl if you weren't careful. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought of it as peaceful, untouched wilderness, the kind of place I had dreamed of working in. The first few weeks passed without incident. My days were filled with the usual duties, checking trails, monitoring for illegal camping, maintaining signs, and occasionally helping hikers who had lost their way. Nights were harder. The cabin's generator was unreliable, and there was no cell signal for miles. I had to rely on a small satellite phone for emergencies. I got used to the nocturnal sounds, the owls, the occasional coyote, the wind through the trees, but there was something different about the forest at night. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the silence between the sounds. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. One Thursday night, after a long day of patrolling a remote trail system near the western edge of the park, I decided to hike to a ridge I'd been meaning to map. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and not frequented by hikers. By the time I reached the top, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, and the sky was bleeding deep reds and purples. I took a few minutes to mark my GPS points and watch the forest stretch endlessly below me. The silence was overwhelming. No wind, no rustle, just the smell of damp earth and pine. That's when I heard it, a snapping branch down below near the trail I had just left. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I gripped my flashlight and rifle, moving carefully along the ridge so I could see the area without being seen. The snapping continued, intermittent, deliberate, like someone walking with purpose. My stomach sank. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The trail was hours from any public access. I stayed on the ridge, scanning the forest floor below. Shadows moved between the trees, but I couldn't make out shapes. I decided to head back to the cabin, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But as I retraced the trail, I realized something terrifying. The snaps were following me, keeping pace. Faster when I sped up, slower when I slowed. My flashlight caught glimpses of a figure, a man wearing dark clothing, moving silently despite the broken branches and uneven ground. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the area better than anyone. I could outrun him if I kept to the trails and avoided the steepest drops. By the time I reached the gravel road near my cabin, the figure had disappeared. My heart was still racing, but I was relieved to see the cabin in the distance. I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked and that my radio and phone were close at hand. I spent the rest of the night awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods outside. Nothing moved, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were footprints, heavy mud-caked boots, unlike the usual hikers or hunters in the area. They led up the road and then vanished into the trees. I reported the incident to the park supervisor, who told me it might have been an illegal hunter or camper. They emphasized caution, but didn't send anyone out to investigate immediately, so I was on my own for the next few days. I spent the following week doubling my patrols, checking remote trails, and keeping an eye out for anyone who didn't belong. Every day I found signs, broken branches, discarded food wrappers, footprints that didn't match any legal activity. I felt like I was being watched constantly, even during daylight. But I kept my routines and avoided shortcuts, sticking to areas I knew well. By the third week I caught him, or at least I cornered him. I was patrolling a small creek near a trail junction when I spotted a man crouched behind a fallen tree, apparently waiting for someone. He froze when he saw me, and I could tell he hadn't expected anyone. I called the sheriff, keeping a safe distance. The man tried to flee, but the steep terrain and my knowledge of the area left him with few options. Law enforcement arrived quickly and arrested him. He turned out to be a fugitive, hiding out in the forest, watching campers and hikers for weeks. After that, the park felt different. The woods were quiet again, but the silence was no longer comforting. I knew the forest itself wasn't dangerous. The danger was very real, very human. That summer, I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the forest's hidden spaces, and to always be prepared. I stayed the rest of my season without further incident, but every time I walked a trail alone, I remembered the sound of those snapping branches and the way someone had followed me silently through the dark, and I carried that caution with me like a shield. By the end of the season, I had gained a respect for the unpredictability of the wilderness and the very real risks humans can pose within it. That experience changed the way I approached my job and the way I understood the forest, not as a peaceful retreat, but as a place where awareness and vigilance could make the difference between safety and danger. I never let my guard down again. I had just turned 28 when I was assigned as the lone recreation ranger in a small district of the Bitterroot National Forest in western Montana. The year was 2013, and I had spent my 20s bouncing between seasonal ranger jobs in Oregon and Washington. This position was different, isolated, remote, and mostly overlooked by the Park Service. The district covered about 70 square miles of forest and lakes, with the nearest town being Darby, a 90-minute drive over twisting mountain roads. My guard station was an old log cabin, built in the early 1960s, situated on a small clearing overlooking the North Fork of the Bitterroot River. Solar panels had been installed decades ago, but most of the wiring was shot, and power was unreliable at best. I moved in at the beginning of June, unpacked my gear, and started familiarizing myself with the area. The first few weeks were routine, patrolling the dirt roads, checking on backcountry campers, and making sure the riverside fire pits weren't being abused. The forest was quiet, too quiet sometimes, but that's normal in the Bitterroots. Wildlife was abundant, deer, elk, and the occasional black bear. There were sounds at night, the creaks of trees, the rush of water, the distant calls of owls, but I was used to that. I thought I was prepared for isolation. The strange thing started about a month after I moved in. Solar power failed completely one evening, leaving me with just a single lantern and a small propane heater. That night I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing the sound of footsteps outside on the porch, slow and deliberate. The cabin's deck was elevated about 3 feet off the ground, and I had a small metal detector I kept near the door. Every time I got up to check, there was nothing. I told myself it was deer or raccoons walking through the clearing. But by the third night, I started noticing things out of place. My boots moved a few feet from where I left them, Firewood stacked neatly at the edge of the deck would be slightly rearranged, and a small bag of trail mix was gone entirely. I decided to investigate. I spent a morning walking the immediate area, scanning with binoculars, checking every footprint. Nothing human, only wildlife. But what unsettled me most was that there were no tracks leading to or from the cabin. I had walked around the cabin's perimeter a dozen times, yet nothing. It didn't make sense. One night in late July, after a long day of patrolling the backcountry trails, I returned to the cabin just as the sun was dropping behind the hills. The river reflected orange light, and I parked my truck next to the cabin. I noticed the porch light flicker for a moment, then go out. I set up my lantern inside and started preparing dinner. Around 10:30 p.m., I heard the first distinct knock on the cabin door. Sharp, deliberate. I froze, heart racing. I hadn't expected anyone. There were no visitors allowed in this district without prior notification, and I hadn't heard a truck. The knocks came again, 3 this time, evenly spaced. I grabbed my flashlight and carefully opened the door. Nothing. Only the night and the faint sound of the river. I spent the next hour inspecting the surrounding area. I checked the nearby trees, the clearing, the riverbank. I even went down the faint logging trail leading into the woods, 100 yards or so. No one, no footprints, no signs of human activity, just the forest and the river. That night, I didn't sleep much. I stayed alert, listening to every sound. Around 2 a.m., I finally drifted off in my chair, only to wake with a start an hour later. My lantern was knocked over, and my map table had been rifled through. Every paper scattered. My heart sank. I knew I hadn't left it that way. For the next few days, I made small changes. I kept my truck parked closer to the cabin, placed rocks along the deck's edge to detect movement, and kept a baseball bat nearby. I even set a small camera outside the window facing the porch. A week passed with no activity. I began to think I was imagining things. Then one morning I went on a routine river patrol. The riverbank had eroded significantly after a recent rainstorm. As I walked along the trail, I found something I hadn't seen before. Footprints. Human footprints, large and heavy, pressed into the mud along the river. They were fresh, about 3 hours old, and they led from the road down to a small bend in the river, then stopped abruptly. No return path. The prints were enormous, oversized 14, wide and flat. I followed them as far as I could. They disappeared into the woods. I reported it to the local sheriff. They sent a deputy out. He looked around, shook his head. Could be some hunter, he said, but the prints were too deep for boots, almost like the person was walking barefoot. I didn't sleep that night either. The tension peaked on a Thursday night. I had just returned from a long patrol and was about to cook dinner when I heard the sound of my truck starting outside. It was quiet at first, then louder. I looked out the window. The truck was gone. My mind raced. I knew no one could have entered without me noticing. I ran outside, calling into the darkness. My truck was parked 50 feet from the cabin, engine off. The keys were still in my pocket. I looked around, heart pounding. No one. By that point, I realized it was someone testing me, someone trespassing repeatedly. I strengthened all my security measures, set up motion alarms, and finally decided I needed to leave for a day to reset and gather supplies. When I came back the next morning, the cabin was completely untouched. The firewood stacked perfectly, the lanterns in place. The door was locked. Nothing was out of order. For the first time in weeks, it felt normal. I never saw who or what was responsible. Over the next year, I stayed vigilant but saw no further signs. I moved to a different district after my seasonal contract ended. Even now, years later, I can still remember the cold, precise knocks on the cabin door, the silent footsteps outside, and the emptiness of that riverbank trail. It was the isolation that made it worse, the knowledge that if something had gone wrong, I would have been entirely alone, with no one to call, and nothing but the forest around me. In the end, I learned to respect the solitude of the forest, to prepare for anything, and to trust my instincts. That experience made me a better ranger, a more careful observer, and someone who no longer underestimates how unpredictable isolation can make people, or other unknown trespassers, act in the wilderness. I was 24 when I got my first solo posting as a park ranger in a small district of northern Idaho. The nearest town, Pine Ridge, was over 2 hours away by winding forest roads, and my station was a rickety old guard cabin perched on the edge of the Clearwater National Forest. It was late spring 2017, and snow still lingered in patches along the shaded ridges, while the rest of the valley was turning green with new growth. I had been excited at first, imagining long quiet days patrolling trails, checking campers, and listening to the wind in the pines. I hadn't counted on how isolated it truly was, and how every sound in the forest seemed amplified when you were the only human for miles. The first week went fine. I spent my days inspecting trails, marking hazards, and checking on remote campsites. The nights, though, were strange. I had a small wood stove for heat, but it barely cut through the damp chill. The old cabin creaked constantly as the wind moved through the trees, and I would lie awake hearing branches snap outside, birds cawing far too late into the evening. I told myself it was normal. After all, the forest was full of life. But there was a tension in the air, something that made even the most ordinary sounds feel ominous. On the 10th night, I decided to do a late evening patrol of the backcountry trails. It was nearly 10 p.m. when I loaded my truck with supplies, flashlight, spare batteries, a first aid kit, my rifle, and a pair of binoculars. The sky was clear, and the moon had just risen, casting a silvery glow over the forest. I drove slowly down the narrow dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust that sparkled in the moonlight. The smell of pine and wet earth filled the air, and the forest seemed almost alive around me. I turned onto a small logging track that led toward a remote series of abandoned cabins, old ranger outposts from decades earlier. The road was barely more than ruts, overgrown in places, and I had to swerve around fallen logs and deep puddles from recent rain. About 20 minutes in, I noticed something strange. A series of footprints, fresh and deep in the muddy sections, ran alongside the track. They were large, much larger than mine, and they didn't match the pattern of any animal I knew. I stopped the truck and shined my flashlight over the tracks. They were human. At first I thought it might be another ranger or a hiker, but the area was restricted at night, and no one was supposed to be out here after dark. I radioed the station, but there was only static. My heart started beating faster. I decided to follow the tracks cautiously, flashlight in one hand and rifle in the other, keeping my ears open for any sound beyond the usual forest noises. The tracks led to an old clearing near a creek. I stepped out of the truck, feeling the cold mud squish under my boots. The clearing was eerily quiet. My flashlight picked out the remains of an old campsite, rusted cans, a collapsed tent, footprints circling a fire pit long cold. I crouched down to inspect, noticing something that made my stomach turn. The footprints didn't just stop, they were smeared in places, as if something heavy had dragged through the mud. I traced them carefully with my eyes, and they led toward the dense forest on the far side of the clearing. That's when I heard it, a low, guttural growl, like some animal, but deeper and slower, almost human. I froze. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure anyone nearby could hear it. The sound came from just beyond the tree line, moving toward me. I stayed completely still, holding my breath, my rifle ready. The growl stopped for a moment, then a snapping branch, then silence again. I knew whatever it was. It wasn't a normal animal. I made the decision to retreat. Slowly I backed toward my truck, keeping my eyes on the tree line. My foot hit something solid and I stumbled, shining my flashlight to see what I'd hit. Another set of footprints, larger than before, heading in the opposite direction from the ones I had been following. It was clear now. I wasn't alone, and whoever, or whatever, had been here was still out there. I jumped into my truck and locked the doors, trying not to breathe too loudly. My hand shook as I started the engine. I didn't dare drive fast. The road was slick and dark. I kept my eyes on the shadows flitting between trees, expecting movement at any moment. I drove for nearly 40 minutes before I felt safe enough to radio the main station again. This time I got a response, though it was strained. I gave them my location and reported what I had found. They assured me a team would check the area first thing in the morning. When daylight came, I hiked back to the clearing with 2 senior rangers. The tracks were gone. No drag marks, no signs of anyone having been there recently. The fire pit and campsite remains were still, as if no one had been near. We checked the surrounding forest, but found nothing. Wildlife tracks were there. Deer, raccoons, foxes, but nothing matching what I had seen. After that, I never returned to that logging track at night. The rest of my season passed without incident, though I never forgot the way the forest felt that night. Alive, aware, and something watching. The experience taught me something critical about isolation, nature, and respect for areas far from civilization. You can prepare for the usual hazards, storms, animals, fires, but there are things you can't anticipate. And when you're alone in a dark forest, the line between careful observation and sheer panic can be thinner than you ever imagine. I left that posting at the end of the summer, but every time I drive past northern Idaho, I think about those tracks, the growl, and the sense that someone, or something, had been following me. And even now, years later, I still double-check the shadows when I'm alone in the woods. I started as a seasonal ranger in 2016, fresh out of college, at a small district in northern Montana. I was 24, a little naive about how intense life in the backcountry could get, but I had spent most of my life hiking and camping, so I felt ready. My station was a small wooden cabin tucked into a thick valley between two ridges. There was no cell service, and the nearest town was nearly 2 hours away by dirt road. Electricity came from solar panels, which worked most of the time, but had quirks I didn't yet understand. Water came from a nearby creek, filtered and boiled for drinking. It was quiet, maybe too quiet, but I liked it at first. The job was simple on paper. Patrol the trails, check on campers, monitor wildlife, and report any issues to the district office. But there was always something unpredictable about this particular patch of forest. Weather changed fast. Wildlife could be aggressive, and the logging roads and old mining paths had a way of confusing even experienced hikers. I spent my first few weeks getting familiar with the trails, marking dead trees, noting erosion on paths, and checking trailheads for maintenance. The valley had a reputation for being wild, though nothing dangerous had happened in years. One late September evening, I was making a routine patrol along a narrow logging road that wound along the West Ridge. I had driven my ranger truck as far as it could go, then hiked the last few miles with a backpack, flashlight, and bear spray. The sun was low, the forest golden with fall colors. The air was crisp, smelling of pine, wet earth, and decaying leaves. I reached a small creek crossing where the road ended, parked my pack, and started making notes in my journal. Around dusk, I noticed something odd. Across the creek, near a cluster of old mining equipment that had long been abandoned, I saw fresh footprints in the soft mud. They weren't animal tracks. They were human. They were large, maybe size 12, and they led from the old equipment into the thicker woods. I felt a chill because no one was supposed to be there. Campers had to check in at designated trailheads, and there had been no reports of anyone in that area. I decided to follow the tracks cautiously. The sun was almost gone, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the forest floor. My flashlight cut a narrow beam through the darkening woods. The tracks led deeper and deeper into an area I hadn't patrolled before, a section of forest riddled with fallen trees and tangled underbrush. The air grew colder, heavier, and the usual sounds of crickets and birds had gone silent. I kept walking, careful to avoid snapping twigs or making noise. After about 30 minutes, the track stopped at a small clearing. My flashlight revealed an old cabin, long abandoned, with the roof partially caved in and walls rotting. What unsettled me most was the smell, smoke, faint but recent, mixed with wet dirt and rust. Someone had been here not long ago. I checked around, careful to stay in the shadows, and saw a small fire pit with ashes still warm. Nearby, I found more tracks leading further into the trees, toward a ridge that dropped sharply into a canyon. My stomach sank. This was the kind of terrain where people could get seriously hurt, especially if they were unprepared. I decided to retreat and report it. As I turned to head back, I noticed movement in the trees across the creek, a dark shape shifting between the trunks. My pulse quickened. Whoever or whatever it was, they were watching me. I could feel their eyes, though I couldn't see a face. I backed away slowly, keeping the flashlight on the area just long enough to track any movement. The figure disappeared. I hiked quickly back to my truck, careful not to run, but ready to defend myself if needed. Once I reached the truck, I radioed the district office. The operator was calm but concerned. They reminded me not to engage anyone unless absolutely necessary and to mark the location. I made careful notes, took photos of the footprints, and stayed in my truck until dark, watching the ridge across the creek. Nothing moved after that. The next morning, a search team arrived from the main station. Rangers combed the woods for hours, finding more footprints but no person. Eventually, they determined someone had been camping illegally, possibly hunting or just hiding. The abandoned cabin had been used as a temporary shelter, and the smoke indicated a recent fire, but no signs of violence. We checked the nearby trails and ridges and found some makeshift traps and equipment, likely left behind by someone trying to avoid detection. I spent the rest of the season thinking about that night. I learned to respect the forest's unpredictability, to trust instincts, and to never assume a quiet night meant safety. By the end of my contract, I had patrolled hundreds of miles of trail alone, seen bears and cougars at a distance, and faced harsh weather, but nothing shook me like those footprints and the sense of being watched. When I left that ranger district, I drove down the winding road one last time. Looking back at the thick forest and old cabin, I knew someone was still out there sometimes, moving silently through the trees, living off the grid in the Montana wilderness. The experience stayed with me, a reminder that wilderness isn't just empty. It's unpredictable, alive, and capable of making you feel very small and very exposed. Even years later, whenever I patrol alone or hike in remote areas, I remember that night. I check my bearings twice, keep my radio charged, and always watch for footprints or signs of someone else. It's a lesson that real danger doesn't need ghosts or monsters. It just needs someone unprepared in a forest that doesn't forgive mistakes. I started my first solo summer as a park ranger in 2018 at a small district in northeastern Oregon. I was 24, freshly out of the ranger training program, and eager to prove myself. The station was small, just a weathered wooden cabin tucked into a clearing off a winding gravel road. The nearest town, where the gas station and grocery store were, was over an hour and a half away by car. The park itself was dense with old-growth fir and cedar, with moss-draped branches, steep ridges, and narrow streams that cut deep into the valley floors. I had been warned that this part of the forest had a reputation for being quiet in ways that made your skin crawl if you weren't careful. I didn't think much of it at the time. I thought of it as peaceful, untouched wilderness, the kind of place I had dreamed of working in. The first few weeks passed without incident. My days were filled with the usual duties, checking trails, monitoring for illegal camping, maintaining signs, and occasionally helping hikers who had lost their way. Nights were harder. The cabin's generator was unreliable and there was no cell signal for miles. I had to rely on a small satellite phone for emergencies. I got used to the nocturnal sounds, the owls, the occasional coyote, the wind through the trees, but there was something different about the forest at night. It wasn't the sound itself, it was the silence between the sounds. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. One Thursday night, after a long day of patrolling a remote trail system near the western edge of the park, I decided to hike to a ridge I'd been meaning to map. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, and not frequented by hikers. By the time I reached the top, the sun had dipped behind the mountains, and the sky was bleeding deep reds and purples. I took a few minutes to mark my GPS points and watch the forest stretch endlessly below me. The silence was overwhelming. No wind, no rustle, just the smell of damp earth and pine. That's when I heard it, a snapping branch down below near the trail I had just left. At first I thought it was an animal, maybe a deer or a bear. I gripped my flashlight and rifle, moving carefully along the ridge so I could see the area without being seen. The snapping continued, intermittent, deliberate, like someone walking with purpose. My stomach sank. There shouldn't have been anyone there. The trail was hours from any public access. I stayed on the ridge, scanning the forest floor below. Shadows moved between the trees, but I couldn't make out shapes. I decided to head back to the cabin, thinking maybe I was overreacting. But as I retraced the trail, I realized something terrifying. The snaps were following me, keeping pace. Faster when I sped up, slower when I slowed. My flashlight caught glimpses of a figure, a man wearing dark clothing, moving silently despite the broken branches and uneven ground. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew the area better than anyone. I could outrun him if I kept to the trails and avoided the steepest drops. By the time I reached the gravel road near my cabin, the figure had disappeared. My heart was still racing, but I was relieved to see the cabin in the distance. I double-checked that the doors and windows were locked and that my radio and phone were close at hand. I spent the rest of the night awake, flashlight in hand, scanning the woods outside. Nothing moved, but I didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked the perimeter of the cabin. There were footprints, heavy mud-caked boots, unlike the usual hikers or hunters in the area. They led up the road and then vanished into the trees. I reported the incident to the park supervisor, who told me it might have been an illegal hunter or camper. They emphasized caution, but didn't send anyone out to investigate immediately. So I was on my own for the next few days. I spent the following week doubling my patrols, checking remote trails and keeping an eye out for anyone who didn't belong. Every day I found signs, broken branches, discarded food wrappers, footprints that didn't match any legal activity. I felt like I was being watched constantly, even during daylight. But I kept my routines and avoided shortcuts, sticking to areas I knew well. By the third week, I caught him, or at least I cornered him. I was patrolling a small creek near a trail junction when I spotted a man crouched behind a fallen tree, apparently waiting for someone. He froze when he saw me, and I could tell he hadn't expected anyone. I called the sheriff, keeping a safe distance. The man tried to flee, but the steep terrain and my knowledge of the area left him with few options. Law enforcement arrived quickly and arrested him. He turned out to be a fugitive, hiding out in the forest, watching campers and hikers for weeks. After that, the park felt different. The woods were quiet again, but the silence was no longer comforting. I knew the forest itself wasn't dangerous. The danger was very real, very human. That summer, I learned to trust my instincts, to respect the forest's hidden spaces, and to always be prepared. I stayed the rest of my season without further incident, but every time I walked a trail alone, I remembered the sound of those snapping branches and the way someone had followed me silently through the dark, and I carried that caution with me like a shield. By the end of the season, I had gained a respect for the unpredictability of the wilderness and the very real risks humans can pose within it. That experience changed the way I approached my job and the way I understood the forest, not as a peaceful retreat, but as a place where awareness and vigilance could make the difference between safety and danger. I never let my guard down again. I had just finished my second summer as a park ranger in the Bitterroot National Forest in Montana. I was 24 at the time, and it was my first year assigned alone to the Northern District, which covered over 60,000 acres of dense forest, rocky ridges, and winding rivers. The nearest town was Darby, nearly 2 hours away by the slow mountain roads. My cabin was small, wooden, and built in the 1960s, with a creaking porch that faced a clearing surrounded by towering pine and fir trees. Power came from a small solar array, which was barely enough to keep the lights and heater running. Water was drawn from a nearby stream, filtered and boiled, and firewood was my lifeline for warmth during the long nights. It was mid-September. The days were getting shorter, and the nights were cold enough that frost started to form on the edges of my windows. Most of the park's visitors had already left, leaving the trails empty and the campgrounds silent. I preferred it that way. Alone, I could patrol, check for fallen trees blocking trails, inspect bridges, and make sure no one was leaving garbage or breaking regulations. But the forest at that time of year had a way of making the silence feel unnatural. The wind whistled through the bare branches, and every snapping twig sounded unnervingly close, even when I knew I was alone. One afternoon, while driving along one of the old logging roads, I spotted something unusual. A set of tire tracks, fresh and deep, leading off the main road into a section of the forest that was technically closed for the season due to fire danger. The tracks were wide, like from an SUV or a small pickup, and they hadn't been there the day before. I made a mental note to check it out later and continued my patrol. By sunset, I returned with my flashlight and a GPS unit. The forest was dark and the trees seemed taller than usual, crowding in around the road. The smell of wet pine needles and decaying leaves was strong. I followed the tracks, which led to a clearing I didn't recognize. In the center, someone had parked an old beat-up red pickup. The tailgate was down, and next to it lay a pile of camping gear, some torn tents, and a few smashed coolers. Nothing looked freshly abandoned, but the whole scene was disorganized, almost like someone had left in a hurry. I circled the area slowly, scanning for any signs of life or danger. My flashlight caught a glint near the edge of the clearing. On closer inspection, I found footprints leading into the forest, smaller than the truck's tires, but human. They looked hurried, uneven. I felt a tightening in my chest. This wasn't the first time I'd found people breaking rules in the park, but something about this scene set me on edge. The forest was quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I noted the location on my GPS and took a few photos for the report. As I turned back toward my truck, I noticed something odd. A small tree, only about 8 feet from the clearing, had deep claw marks etched into its bark. They were fresh. Whoever had been here had passed close to it. My stomach sank. Claw marks that size didn't belong to any animal common to the area. Bears? Maybe, but bears usually swipe trees horizontally, not the vertical gouges I was seeing. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe some hunters had been messing around. Maybe someone was building traps or trying to intimidate me. But the feeling of being watched pressed against me, even in the fading daylight. I packed up, got into my truck, and drove back to my cabin. I locked the doors and made a small fire. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was letting my imagination run wild. That night, sleep didn't come easy. The wind picked up, rattling the windows and shaking the roof. Every few minutes, I thought I heard footsteps on the porch. I checked my rifle, made sure it was loaded, and kept a flashlight on the bedstand. Hours passed, and eventually I dozed off fitfully. Around 2 a.m., I woke to the sound of my front door handle rattling. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. Nothing. The handle rattled again, softer this time, almost hesitant. I grabbed the rifle and slipped into my boots, quietly moving to the door. When I opened it, there was no one. The forest was dark and silent, the clearing beyond illuminated only by moonlight. But then I noticed tracks in the frost leading away from the cabin, toward the creek behind it. Someone or something had been there. I followed the tracks carefully, flashlight in hand. They ended abruptly by a boulder near the creek. No footprints beyond it, no signs of anyone hiding. The next morning I hiked back to the clearing where the red truck had been. There was no sign of it. No tents, no gear, no clawed tree. Everything was gone, as if whoever had been there vanished overnight. I searched the surrounding area for miles, but found nothing. The tracks I had seen at the creek were gone too, likely covered by new frost or the wind. I filed my report, noting everything in detail. Rangers from the district took it seriously, but there was nothing concrete to investigate. A few weeks later, a hiker reported seeing a strange figure moving quickly through the forest near the same clearing. But by the time I arrived, it was gone. Months passed, and I continued my patrols. Every now and then, I would see fresh tracks, claw marks, or signs that someone had been camping in areas closed for the season. But nothing violent ever happened. I never saw the red truck again, and I never caught whoever or whatever was responsible. In the end, it wasn't a ghost or a legend that kept me on edge. It was the knowledge that in a forest this vast, there are always people and things moving quietly, unseen, capable of disappearing without a trace. The job taught me to respect that uncertainty. I stayed alert, followed protocol, and trusted my instincts. By the time I left that district, I felt more prepared for the unpredictability of the forest. Knowing that the real danger isn't always obvious. It's the hidden, the unknown. The things that leave just enough signs to remind you that you're never truly alone out there.